Hello there, welcome to the Saroy channel and welcome to my Omnibus series. I've got so many of these omnibuses that are going to come out so that you'll be able to listen to an hour's worth of stories, which I know you're going to love. You know, the thing is that telling stories is such a fine art, and it's something that was practiced hundreds of years ago when people didn't have the technology that we have today. And everyone would gather around the fire and listen to a wonderful story. And also, what is so wonderful about a story is that personally, I think it is the best way to go to sleep. Every night when I go to bed, I always listen to stories. And that's something that parents used to do with their children. It's something that they still do with their children. There's nothing better than a good story. And so I hope you're going to enjoy this series. And before we start, I just want to say, do subscribe to my channel because you don't want to miss out on anything. Because I'm in for the long haul and I want to make sure that you get the most stunning stories to go to bed with at night or to listen to when you want to be one of those people sitting beside the fire and listening. Don't forget to subscribe to my channel and let's get started. I hope you're going to enjoy the omnibus.
Dear Sarah and all your lovely listeners, my name is Angelica Moon, and I was born and raised in New York City by both of my devoted, very loving parents. Unfortunately, when I was about 10 years old at the time, my poor father tragically died in a catastrophic building construction accident where over 6 other men lost their lives that dreadful day due to faulty substandard equipment and inadequate dodgy scaffolding that had failed to meet the safety standards required. I remember that fateful day when my dad died. I returned home from school and opened the door of our apartment, taking my shoes off in the entrance hall like I always did, and hanging my satchel on the hook. I quickly made my way towards the kitchen. My mother was standing at the kitchen table, staring very intently at the apples in the fruit bowl. "Mummy, I'm hungry," I said. I remember she failed to acknowledge my presence, but instead continued to stare vacantly at the apples in the fruit bowl. I remember wondering why she was so interested in them. I'd never seen anyone so fascinated by golden delicious apples before. "Mummy, I'm hungry," I repeated. "I'm really hungry." All of a sudden, my mother beelined to the refrigerator and began throwing bottles of mayonnaise, packages of ham and cheese at me. The jar of mayonnaise shattered into glass shards all over the floor, and dollops of the yellow gluttonous glug lay splattered everywhere in gelatinous blobs. "You're hungry, are you?" she screamed. "Well then, help yourself, girl." I watched in shock as she stormed out of the kitchen and went to her bedroom, where she slammed the door behind her so violently. Then in a trice she came out so quickly to redeem herself, and sorrowfully gathered me in her arms, looking very ashamed for behaving in such an explosive manner. This behaviour was so incongruous to my mother, who had always been as gentle as a doe and as nurturing as a lioness. "Sorry, baby," she said to me, kissing me on the forehead tenderly. "Mummy's just had a very bad day, that's all." I could see tears pouring down her cheeks like heavy rainfall on a wet day. She was wiping them away with her hands and smudging her mascara so much that she began to look like a raccoon. Then she started to sob and sob. I was so shocked, for I'd never seen my mother so discomposed and distraught before. "Why are you sad, Mummy?" I asked, not quite knowing how to react to my mother's emotional outburst. My mother smiled at me through her salty tears. "Sorry, baby," she said. "Mummy is just very sad today. Do you remember once when I told you about heaven and how beautiful it is there?" "You mean the place with the beautiful angels and the roads that are paved with gold?" I asked. "That's the one," said my mother. "Well, your father's gone on a trip there, and it's so magnificently beautiful he doesn't want to come back." "Well, why can't we go there to be with him?" I suggested. "We won't be allowed through the pearly gates," my mother informed me, "as we haven't received our invitation yet. You can't go when you haven't got an invitation, or they turn you away at the gate, and they won't let you enter. The angels are very nice, but also incredibly strict, so they'll make us go back. When can we get some tickets, I asked my mother, so that we can go and be with Daddy? Not for a long while, my mother said, but one day we'll get our very own special tickets. You see, God designs the invitations himself, and he chooses the date when he'll invite us to his spectacular kingdom to be with him. And when we get there, he'll throw us a very big party with lots and lots of jelly and ice cream. That's not fair, I said. I want a ticket to heaven now. Well, you'll have to wait your turn, dear, said my mother. Everybody has to. And sometimes we might have to wait a long time. We just have to be very patient, that's all. It made me very sad that my dad was not coming back any time soon. Still, I was incredibly happy that he was having such a great time up there. The next day my mother told me that I was going to stay in the bluegrass state of Kentucky with my grandmother, whom I'd never actually met before. You must give your granny this letter for me, she said, packing up my suitcase. Why are you sending me away? I asked. You're just going to your granny for a holiday, my mother had assured me. You'll be back very soon. Mummy needs some time to herself, she said, giving me a huge hug. So there I was, a 10-year-old child, looking outside the taxicab window at a brand new world, so dramatically different to the bustling, lively city of New York where I'd grown up. Instead of the skyscrapers, there were tall, majestic trees. And instead of boutiques selling fancy women's shoes and handbags, there were pretty meadows filled with wild flowers. Instead of little dogs being walked down sidewalks of the city by their human companions, there were horses and cows grazing in the open meadows. And instead of the tarmac roads dotted with yellow taxis, there were rugged country roads lined with trees. I was beguiled and bedazzled by this whole new world. It was so mysterious, arresting and alluring. It teased and titillated the taste buds of my senses with the same kind of wondrous awe I experienced at the ice cream parlour when selecting a brand new flavour of ice cream. I sat in that taxi, mesmerised and transfixed by the passing variable landscapes and scenic vistas of pretty barns, blueberry fields, silvery lakes, symmetrical farmhouses and rolling hills. In a trice, the taxi was driving down a long, uneven, precipitous country road, filled with little potholes and an abundance of pebbles that beat against the underbelly of the taxi, causing it to jolt precariously to the right and then to the left, swaggering away like an intoxicated drunk. Man, I hate these treacherous dirt roads, I could hear the taxi driver moan to himself under his breath. He glanced at me through his rear-view mirror, raising his voice to address me personally. Love, won't be long now, he said. I think your grandfather's farm is off to the next turning. Before long, the taxi drove up to a signpost with an arrow which read, Honeysuckle Heights this way. He proceeded through the open metal-barred gate and drove steadily down a very extensive driveway surrounded by undulating emerald-green countryside on either side. It was exquisitely beautiful. I secretly marvelled that my grandmother owned all this. She must be very rich indeed, I thought to myself, as everyone who owned large amounts of land in New York was always minted. We passed a few horses grazing happily in a meadow, penned in by a white wooden-poled fence, a couple of pretty barns, and a large pond that sparkled and gleamed in the morning sun, and was heavily flanked by trees. Finally the taxi pulled up outside a very charming farmhouse that was as pretty as a picture. It was made from whitewashed brick with pretty bay windows and a very large, sizable front porch. The driver got out of the cab and walked to the trunk, where he retrieved my suitcase and just plonked it on the ground beside me. Finally he climbed back into his taxi and just drove away without a bye or leave. I was rather shocked and put out. I proceeded to walk around the farmhouse, looking for any signs of human life, and that was when I saw an older lady in the backyard throwing out feed for some hungry-looking chickens. The woman turned around and stared at me, and her light blue eyes grew as round as saucers, and her jaw hung open in astonishment. Indeed, she looked so shocked that she dropped the bucket of feed onto the ground. "Jamie," she said, growing as white as a sheet. "Jamie, is that you?" "Jamie's my mother's name," I said. "My name is Angelica. I'm Jamie's daughter, and you're my grandmother. Mummy sent me here to stay with you. I have a letter for you she asked me to give you," I said, handing it to her. My grandmother opened the letter and read it, and the expression on her face looked heartily relieved. She then folded it up and stuffed it into her pocket. "So you're Jamie's little girl," she said, sweeping me into her arms like a precious doll. "You're my granddaughter," she said, giving me a generous hug. I could see there were tears gathering in the corner of her pale blue eyes that threatened to spill down her creamy cheeks. "Do you know, you are the splitting image of your mother when she was your age. When I look at you, at least when I did a moment ago, I thought I was seeing her ghost." "How about a nice glass of homemade lemonade?" she said, leading me into the kitchen. "You must be so thirsty after your journey." "So how is your mother these days?" my grandmother asked me, handing me the lemonade that I drank so gratefully. It was delicious. "My mummy is very, very sad," I said, "because we didn't get tickets to heaven like my dad did. She says we have to wait our turn. It could be a very long time, because you have to receive a special invitation from God, or otherwise the strict angels send you right back home." "I see," said my grandmother. "She must be very sad not to have had an invitation yet." Those were my only memories I really had of being 10 years old, as they were flashbacks of a very poignant, memorable time in my life. Now I was 14 years old, and in 4 whole years I hadn't heard a dicky bird from my mother, and I couldn't comprehend what on earth had happened to her and why she hadn't been in touch. It was as if she had disappeared off the face of the earth, never to be seen or heard from again. Well, so I thought. In truth, my generous grandmother was the very best thing that had happened to me in my young life. God broke the mould when he made her, for she was such a delightful person, of whom I loved dearly. Ever since I'd arrived in Kentucky, my whole life had changed so dramatically, and the idea of living in a large city certainly had lost its illustrious appeal. This was the quintessential place where I'd made so many wonderful friends in the local town, where I'd learnt to ride my favourite bay and black horse, Sinbad, around the most breathtakingly beautiful and scenic countryside imaginable, where I would play with my friends swimming in the creek during the summer months, riding mountain bikes down country trails and exploring the dreamy wood green, consisting of statuesque oaks, maples and dogwoods. My life was adventurous and exciting, and I dreaded the day when my mother came back to take me back to the Big Apple. One day my grandmother sat me down at the kitchen table and said, "I think you're old enough, Angelica, to learn about why your mother and I had a huge falling out when she was a young girl, and why she left this farmhouse to go and live with her father." "I didn't know that you and my mother had a falling out," I said, looking at my grandmother in surprise. This was the first time I've heard of such a thing. "It's a long story," said my grandmother, pouring me a glass of her delicious homemade lemonade. "What happened?" I asked. "Please tell me." "Your mother was a very sensitive child," said my grandmother. "Indeed, I'd go so far as to say that she was emotionally delicate and fragile. She cared passionately about the feelings of everybody, most especially animals of every single kind. I remember one day when her father killed a large spider, she was desperately upset about it, and immediately took the body into the garden to bury it, and she even performed a funeral service for the insect. It took her a long time to forgive her dad for that incident. It upset her greatly." "Why did you kill it?" she piped. "It was not doing you any harm." "I'm afraid your grandfather Eric was not a good man. I wish I could say differently, but I can't. He was a devious, duplicitous accountant who pretended to help people with their finances while charging a sizable fee in the process. He was a callous swindler who would pilferage money from people, most especially the old, vulnerable and naive. When I realised what was going on with Eric, I was utterly appalled, so much so that I warned the townsfolk not to trust him in dealing with their financial affairs, as he was as cunning as a fox, as sharp as an eagle, as greedy as a seagull, and as deceptive as a spider luring its prey into its web. At the time I was too afraid to go to the sheriff, so I would surreptitiously warn people not to hire Eric's services. I was exceedingly fortunate, as I've always had green fingers, and so the produce in the farm provided a great income for the both of us, and we wanted for absolutely nothing. Of course Eric wanted a lot more, which I could never comprehend, as he had an insatiable gluttonous greed to get rich, and he didn't care what nefarious means he would exploit in order to accomplish his insidiously evil aim. He was so narcissistic that he didn't care who he hurt in the process. I remember he'd come home at night in one hell of a bad mood, because no one wanted to hire him as an accountant, and he could not understand why, and it incensed and infuriated him greatly. Eric never cared about anyone, with one exception, of course, and that was his beloved Jamie, who was the apple of his eye. He would have walked to the moon and back for that child, as he loved her so very much. When Jamie was 10 years old, like you are, she encountered a little wild boy in the woods, and the two of them became inseparable and were like brother and sister. I was so thrilled for Jamie, and this friendship was great for her. You see, Blueberry was good for her. He taught her to be less reactive to things in life that sometimes happened. He had the capacity to ground her, and she became less overwrought emotionally and more balanced in her life. "What's a wild boy?" I asked. Well, he was a human being in a manner of speaking, but more at home in the natural world than we would be. He was covered in blue-grey long shaggy hair, with a pyramid-shaped head and overlong arms, with the sweetest, most beautiful brown eyes that you've ever seen in your life, so full of energy. Jamie would spend most of the time playing with the wild boy in the woodgrove, who she chose to call Blueberry. Those two would get up to all kinds of mischief together. They were so naughty. I do not think your mother ever saw Blueberry as any different to herself, even though he didn't speak a word of English and was covered in hair. Funny enough, there was no language barrier between the two of them, as they knew exactly what the other was thinking. It was an extraordinary friendship. Sometimes Jamie brought him home for tea. I do remember Blueberry adored my pecan nut pie and vanilla ice cream. I also recall he'd help himself liberally to all the fruit in my fruit bowl, most especially the grapes. He really loved grapes. I did find Blueberry to be very wary of adults, most especially your grandfather, and I can understand in the circumstances. He was desperately shy, introverted and self-effacing, but he knew how to communicate incredibly well. I do remember if he liked something, he would tap his stomach appreciatively. If he was still hungry, he would pat his stomach and stretch out his palm, and that meant he wanted more. On one occasion, he literally ate 3 pieces of my pecan nut pie in less than 5 minutes. He loved it so much. If Blueberry didn't understand something, he would scratch his head in contemplation. If he needed to go back home, he would clap his hands a couple of times, and then you knew he was leaving. How did my grandfather feel about my mother playing with the wild boy? He wasn't happy about the relationship at all. I think he was almost jealous by how devoted Jamie was to Blueberry. Of course, he was careful not to express his misgivings to his own daughter, for fear of upsetting her or ruffling her feathers, given her sensitivity. Jamie was oblivious to the fact that he was not remotely happy about her relationship with Blueberry, especially when he saw your mother swimming in the creek with Blueberry, while his mother sat on the riverbank, happily watching the two of them throwing a ball backwards and forwards to each other, having a whale of a time. When your grandfather saw the size of Blueberry's mother, he nearly had a heart attack on the spot. He described her as being the most terrifying, scary beast that he'd ever seen in all his life, easily capable of killing a man in a single blow. He even informed me that Blueberry's mother was a Nephilim from the Bible, and deserved death as her punishment for being what he described as despicably evil. I saw the female creature once myself, and while she was intimidating, standing at about 8 foot tall and 600 pounds, I can assure you that anyone with a degree of perception and a godly heart would have discerned that she was a gentle soul without an ounce of malice in that body of hers. I remember one day when it was my birthday, Blueberry brought me a large bunch of wild flowers that he had picked in the meadows for me, which I thought was so incredibly sweet of him. Sadly, they didn't last very long in the vase, but wilted and died. But Blueberry, much like his mother, was such a kindly soul, always thinking of others before himself. One day I heard about an elderly lady in town that your grandfather had offered to help with her last will and testament, and I was certain that he was up to his old tricks again. I went to visit the old lady. The woman was in her early 90s, and very hard of hearing, with abysmal and appalling eyesight. She was without doubt an ideal candidate for Eric to exploit, with his silvery tongue and false assurances. Eric was quite literally a wolf in sheep's clothing, using his faith as a way to lure people into a false sense of security. This lovely old lady was eager to leave her sizable fortune to her granddaughter, but when I sat down with her over tea, I asked if I might look at the papers that Eric had drawn out for her and asked her to sign. I was mortified when she told me she didn't even need to look at the paperwork, because she trusted Eric implicitly, as she had been fooled into believing that he was a reputable man of God that could clearly be trusted. Would you believe it, your grandfather had made absolutely sure that the poor old lady had signed over half her estate to him, so he would ultimately have become a very wealthy man as a result. Eric was a snake in the grass that gave you the false impression he was as innocent as a lamb. I immediately made the corrections to all the paperwork and asked her to sign the amendments so that Eric got absolutely nothing. I told her that Eric had deceived her, and she was enraged. He seemed like such a nice, godly man, she told me. Why would he deceive me like this? I'm sorry, I told her. My husband is not honest. The old woman looked at me and said, Well, why, dear, are you still married to him then? Why would you want to live with someone so deplorably dishonest? When she said that to me, it was like a light bulb went off in my head. I remember thinking that the woman was absolutely right. It had not even crossed my mind to leave your grandfather before. But the more I thought about it, the more I liked the idea. I did not enjoy being married to a scoundrel that was so willing to rob people of their life savings, who clearly didn't have a conscience. I think it must have been a week later when I told your grandfather that I was filing for a divorce, and he became so overwhelmed by anger that he began throwing things around the house violently. Eventually he settled down and composed himself and said that he wanted full custody of Jamie, and I said that that was never ever going to happen. He said to me, Woman, if you don't give me full custody of Jamie, I'll make sure that I get it. What your grandfather did next was so appalling it defies belief. One day when the wild boy came over for tea and Jamie went to the toilet to relieve herself, leaving the wild boy in the kitchen with me, your grandfather walked into the kitchen and put a couple of bullets into the wild boy's head, killing him at point-blank range. He killed the wild boy, I cried out in horror. How could he do that? I was appalled and shocked by what had happened, said my grandmother. I was too speechless to say another word, because I loved that wild boy. Your grandfather started screaming, What have you done, woman? How could you kill Jamie's best friend like this? And before our daughter entered the kitchen, he firmly thrust the revolver in my hand, so that it looked like that I had murdered little Blueberry. Jamie ran to the wild boy, cradling him in her arms and howling. She looked at me with such a vicious hatred in her eyes. I will never ever forget her despairing look, as she said, How could you, Mum? How could you do this evil thing? He was my very best friend. Look what you've done. Jamie was crying so much and was inconsolable with grief, and her father bustled her into the car, saying, We're leaving now, Jamie. Your grandmother is an evil, very treacherous woman. We must go. But, Daddy, I need to bury my friend, Jamie protested indignantly. That's Blueberry's mother's job, not yours, your grandfather had reassured her. They both got into the car and drove away, and that was the last time I ever saw Jamie. But I don't understand. Why did you not tell Jamie that her father had killed Blueberry, and that it wasn't you? I protested. Surely Mum wasn't so gullible as to believe her father's insidious lies. Sweetheart, your mother wouldn't listen. Everything was black and white to her at her age. She had seen me with the rifle in my hands, or rather the revolver, if you like, and believed her father's treacherous lies. Her father was a very clever man. It would seem your grandfather very successfully poisoned your mother's mind against me, and guilefully deceived her into believing that I was indeed capable of doing this heinous, despicable act. She bought into the whole grievous lie, hook, line, and sinker, it would seem. It was as if my daughter conveniently forgot how much I had loved and adored little Blueberry. Instead, she informed me over the telephone in no uncertain terms that she hated and despised me, and never wanted to see me again as long as she lived, and it broke my heart. I knew in my gut one day when Jamie was older and wiser that she would discern the truth for herself and see Eric for whom he really was, and it seems I was absolutely right, because this was the letter your mother asked you to give me when you first came to stay here on the farm with me. Dearest Mother, sorry I left you all those years ago. I really and truly am. I was a naive and deceived fool to believe you were capable of killing Blueberry. On remorseful reflection, I concede that you did indeed love my hairy friend. I know now father was responsible for this hideously iniquitous staged event, which he pulled off superbly, for I fell for his treacherous act like a duck to water. I can only apologise for being so easily swayed and led astray. I don't know why I fell for such a lie. My father knew how to make others look guilty for his own deplorable crimes. It seemed that the wings of karma finally caught up with him like a bird on the wind, because someone shot him in the head several years back for defrauding them. It seems he met the same fate as Blueberry, who did not deserve to die like this. Please look after my daughter, as I trust her in your loving charge. I will come back to collect her one day when I'm good and ready. I'm dealing with the tragic loss of her father, and the grief is so overwhelming, I need the space to heal. Much love, your daughter Jamie. Wow, I said to my grandmother. She finally came to her senses and saw her father for what he really was. What about Blueberry's mother? What happened to her? I asked. How did she cope with her son's death? It was extraordinary, said my grandmother. After your grandfather left the house with Jamie, the wild woman bolted into the house and came charging into the kitchen like a bull in a china shop. She knew something was wrong with her son. She could feel it in her gut. Call it a mother's intuition if you like. It was amazing because she was a reticent creature at the very best of times, as I'd only ever briefly seen her in passing. On this occasion, all the awkwardness had lifted between the two of us. I don't know how to say this to you, but I think a mother's instinct had overcome her to such an extent that she forgot her awkward shyness. I was on the kitchen floor holding her deceased son and rocking him back and forth in my arms, bawling my eyes out and telling him how sorry I was. I remember I looked up from where I was sitting, and I could see Blueberry's mother just standing there, and her sad, devastated eyes met mine. She knew instinctively her youngling was dead, but she also discerned that I was not responsible for his demise. She knew that at once. The two of us sat together on the floor, taking turns to cradle her beloved. We were united in our grief and sense of loss, that in some way it bonded us together in such an unlikely way. The wild woman did not cry tears, but she did make this deep guttural sound in her throat that was the most despairing sound that I've ever heard in my life. I put my arms around the wild woman, although of course she was so big I couldn't get them around her physically. We both wailed and wailed together. She then picked Blueberry up, and I watched her glide away into the woods with him, and then she was gone from my sight. I never saw her again for many long years, until about 5 years later, when I was in the kitchen making jam over the stone in a bubbling cauldron. I immediately sensed that someone was standing behind me, and imagine my immense surprise and rapturous joy when I turned around and there was Blueberry's mother, and in her arms she was holding a beautiful, precious baby. I was so honoured because she had brought her baby boy to show me, and she was an extremely proud mother. I was over the moon to see her again. We embraced tenderly, and I cried into her shoulders while she patted my back affectionately like a very old dear friend. We had bonded over the death of her precious son, whom she knew I had dearly loved. I was able to hold that baby of hers, and it was the most adorable thing I've ever seen. We sat on the kitchen floor playing together with her beautiful baby and eating pecan nut pie together, and the wild woman ate 3 large pieces, just like Blueberry would have done. She then communicated to me that she was passing through the area and needed to go away again, but she gave me several eagle feathers as a gift, and then she was gone. But she did tell me she would be back again, and I have seen her a couple more times. I truly consider her one of my dearest friends. Tears were pouring down my cheeks, because this was the most beautiful story that I'd ever heard in my entire life. Fast forward to when I was 15 years old, when my mother showed up unexpectedly on my grandmother's doorstep, and that was a beautiful moment, as we all embraced and hugged. It was an emotional reunion for the 3 of us, and we all bawled our eyes out. My mother apologised profusely for being away for so long, but she had taken a long time to overcome her grief. She also apologised to my grandmother again for everything that had happened concerning Blueberry. All these years later, I now reside in this farmhouse with my mother, my husband, and our 2 children, and of course my beloved grandmother, who is still very much alive. We have extended the farmhouse so we can live together happily as an extended family, as I don't want to live anywhere else in the world. The creature that visits us from time to time, or Blueberry's mother if you like, is clearly a Bigfoot, and I've seen her once with my very own eyes, and I can only describe her to you as one of the most beautiful creatures that I've ever seen. She is so majestic and lofty. So don't let anyone fool you into believing all Bigfoots are monsters. You do get human monsters like my grandfather, and Bigfoot monsters too. But do not tar everybody with the same brush, for that would be a grievous mistake to make. Believe me, I know. So there you are. That's my story. Dear Sarah, and all your lovely listeners, my name is Eloise, and I'm from West Virginia, where I grew up with my parents, my sister Daphne and my brother Robin, on an exquisitely beautiful vintage farm in the countryside, where we lived in a very charming rustic colonial farmhouse that had graced several generations of the Armstrong family. And even the brick walls of our home seemed to harbour the energy of all the bygone people that had resided here once long before us. For indeed there were times when gay laughter could be heard filtering in the hallway, and light childlike footsteps could be discerned flying hurriedly down the sweeping staircase, but no one was ever there. Sometimes in the kitchen you could smell the distinct delicious aroma of homemade baked bread, but sadly no one was baking anything at all. Then there was always the smell of lavender cologne in the library, and the aromatic odour of cigar smoke would sometimes waft through the living room. My parents would shrug their shoulders in a nonchalant, unperturbed way, and say it's an old house with a history. These things should always be expected. So we grew up with these curious ethereal anomalies as an intrinsic, undiscernible part of our lives. So for us to experience something outer-worldly was as normal as brushing our teeth. Suffice to say that did not interfere in our lives in an offensive or even disturbing way. It just was part of the quintessential, rather charming, happy energy of living in an older home that basked in the glory of its vibrant, rich history, rather like a lizard sunning itself gloriously on a rock. It just was, and that was all there was to it. We lived on several acres of undulating, verdant, green, vibrant countryside, surrounded by imposing pyramid-shaped mountains and dreamy forests of statuesque trees that rose up into the heavens like masterful giants of such grace, majesty, and repose, some that had seen through generations of our family and had held on to the secrets of those who have lived before us. We had a couple of meadows on our land where several of our family horses grazed happily, and a small field that was devoted especially for the goats, all who wore bells around their necks so you could hear them tinkering in the countryside. We also had hundreds of chickens and 2 rambunctious collie dogs that followed my father everywhere he went, as they were completely devoted to him. We possessed a stable block, a couple of barns, and a silvery pond. The area where we lived was full of horse riding, hiking and running trails, and vast areas of wood green which stretched back for mile upon mile. Growing up, my siblings and I embraced an outdoor lifestyle vigorously, with an ardent enthusiasm and zest for the great outdoors. We enjoyed exploring the rugged pastoral countryside, most especially the woodland areas where we loved playing at the enchanting bridge over the creek, as it was a magical place to congregate. One day all 3 siblings went mountain biking down one of the country trails, and that was the first time we ever saw what I now know was a Bigfoot. At that time we had no idea what we were beholding. It was my brother Robin who spotted the critter first, and shouted, "Look over there, behind the tree!" I could see a dark figure that was easily 6 foot tall, peeking at us inquisitively from behind a large tree trunk. I remember being completely astonished, because this creature was unlike anything I've ever witnessed before in my life, as it looked almost human, only infinitely much bigger, and covered in long brown hair with blonde and red highlights. The critter peered at us again, looking at us through mischievous dark eyes. I believe it wanted to play with us, but it was way too shy to do so, so it hurriedly darted away through the wood green. We dismounted our bikes and immediately chased after the creature through the woods, but it had vanished from our sight and was disappointingly nowhere to be found. For many days we took the same bicycle trail again and again and again in the vain hope of spotting the unusual critter that we had chanced upon, for we were as interested in him as he had been in us. The bicycle trail was surrounded by highly heavily forested rocky embankments, so it was hard to see between all the trees. Sadly, we never saw the creature, although we instinctively sensed that he could see us, as we always felt as if we were not alone, and that something was watching us. One day on one of our bicycle rides, my sister Daphne became very distracted by a red fox that randomly crossed our path fleetingly, glancing at us ever so briefly, and then beelining to the trees. It was clearly not happy to have been seen by us in broad daylight. "Look," said Daphne, "a red fox!" She loosened her grip on her bicycle, while the wheels zigzagged precariously and went flying over a rocky ledge, and she ended up being thrown off her bicycle, where she hit the ground with a mighty force. It was clear that she was rather badly injured, as she was clutching her lower stomach and appeared to be in agonizing pain. "Ouch!" she cried. "It really hurts! My stomach feels all twisted." I knew at once that Daphne was not in a good way and needed urgent medical attention. I could tell she was spaced out, and her face was a ghostly white and ashen, almost as if the colour had drained from her skin. My brother and I were in a quandary as what on earth to do, and it was decided that he would go back to the farmhouse to call for help, while I stayed with my sister. That was when help of an unlikely, unusual, most unexpected source came to our rescue. It was the outlandish creature we had once observed, hiding behind the trees of all things. What on earth was it? It came bolting through the woods, sounding like a herd of bison, as it thundered towards us, running over to my sister with a look of very grave concern and consternation written on his face. The strange critter unhesitantly lifted Daphne into his powerful, strong, overlong arms and pointed towards our farmhouse, as if to say, "I'll be taking her there." I nodded, for in my youthful naivety I was quick to trust the critter's noble intent, not doubting for a moment that we were being divinely assisted. It would seem that the critter knew exactly where we lived, which was a monumental relief for me. We watched in wondrous awe as the creature ran like greased lightning ahead of us, carrying my sister in his arms, and moving speedily like a very fast, brisk wind, tunnelling across a desert. We followed far behind him on our bicycles. I was befuddled at this reticent, evasive creature that had suddenly made his appearance known, appearing from the dark shadows of the woods like a bright angel of light, once we had needed his help. But what on earth was he, I wondered? I couldn't even imagine. The only thing I could say about him was that he was like a wild boy, covered in long dark brown hair, with auburn and blonde highlights. He was easily 6 foot tall, 500 pounds and 3 feet wide across the upper shoulders. The critter was long and lanky, but very muscular, with a cone-shaped head, an incredibly human face, with deep-set intelligent eyes that seemed to denote a wisdom of way beyond his years. His countenance exuded a vigorous youthful energy, charged with an exuberant enthusiasm that gave me the distinct impression that despite his great size, he was possibly still a youngling. Once we arrived at the farmhouse, my sister was lying on the grass, yards away from the front door, groaning in pain. But the mysterious wild boy had long since departed the scene, but somehow I sensed in my gut that he was still secretly watching us. In short, my sister had suffered a devastating internal injury to the ovaries from which she made a full, very swift recovery. Daphne's surgeon sadly announced that she'd never be able to conceive children, which hit us very hard as a family, especially since this was just a bicycle accident, for goodness sake. As you can imagine, this horrifying revelation completely devastated both my parents, as they eagerly looked forward to becoming grandparents one day. However, to Daphne, who was a perpetual tomboy at the time, who wished she had been born a boy, it was just water off a duck's back. Why would she ever care about not being able to have children one day, in the long, distant future? After the unforeseen accident with my sister, the wild boy became significantly less reserved, seemingly eager to interact with us. When we would ride our bicycles down the long, rugged country lanes, he would often run alongside us like a devoted, loving dog. We grew incredibly fond of him, and chose to call him Bear. Sometimes we would play around the bridge over the creek together, and Bear communicated with us by using his arms in wildly dramatic, effusive gestures, enhanced by expressive facial expressions, sometimes even drawing vigorously in the ground with a twig, in order to be more clearly understood. For although Bear could speak a language, it was undecipherable to us and sounded like Chinese or Mandarin. From what we could fathom, his family travelled around like nomads from place to place, often following railway lines, electric pylons and watercourses, as they thoroughly enjoyed discovering new exciting locations and following food sources. Bear had a father and a mother and 2 older brothers, and he was the youngest in his family, and his people were by nature very evasive, gentle and peace-loving giants. They were exceedingly suspicious of humans, tending to keep a safe, wary distance from the likes of us. Bear revealed to us that he had been fascinated by us all of his life, and had secretly watched us since we were very small, as he had been the same. He knew so much about our family. I learnt on several occasions he had returned our billy goats to our field when they had escaped, because he had discerned how upset my father became when 1 or 2 of them went astray. To confirm this fact, he started to reenact my father's distressed, overwrought, frantic behaviour as he panicked when he couldn't find one of his goats. We all cracked up laughing, as Bear deserved an Academy Award for his masterful reenactment and interpretation of my father. We rolled on the ground and our stomachs ached from laughter, as Bear was a comedian of note who could make you laugh at the drop of a hat. I do remember Bear randomly announced once that there were some of his kind that sometimes turned rogue, exhibiting incongruous behaviour, becoming aggressively dangerous, not only to people, but their own kind as well. He described these creatures as mentally ill, disturbed, or not right in the head. Sometimes he had witnessed some bloody fights that had not always ended well for his kind, causing a great deal of distress. Over the years we could see Bear on and off, depending on how long his family stayed in our location. As children, he was our biggest secret. We never shared him with our parents, because at best we believed they would disapprove of our relationship with the wild boy, and at worst they wouldn't believe us at all. I was used to my parents doubting our credibility on things, so there were things we would willfully choose not to share with them. On one occasion, my sister and I had seen a woman that looked alarmingly like her, in her facial appearance, that is. The woman was walking across our courtyard, wearing 1800s clothes. I discerned she was attired in a magnificent blue gown that was so glamorously ornate. She looked like she belonged in a ballroom of all places. For a moment she stopped very still and looked directly at us, appearing rather caught off guard, as if she hadn't quite expected to see us. All of a sudden her image just faded, becoming more and more translucent, until she was gone completely from our sight. As it was a spurious sighting that we had observed during the day, when we excitedly told my mother about the apparition that we had discerned, she doubted our account, most especially because she didn't believe ghosts could be seen during the day. That was until she saw the apparition for herself, when she was outside in the yard hanging washing on the line. My mother was so astonished by what she was beholding that she fainted from the shock. We literally had to bring her round with smelling salts. She looked at us with eyes as wide as saucers and said, "I've just seen a ghost in the middle of the day." Over the years there have been lots of sightings of this mysterious woman on our farm. Even guests who visited us claimed to have seen a beautiful woman in an exquisitely elegant blue gown crossing their path, who they falsely assumed was Daphne dressed to the nines for a fancy dress ball. They would see her quite often whilst driving down our driveway to the house. We called her the Blue Lady. Who she was and what she was doing on our land, I'm not certain, but it is likely she may indeed have been an ancient relative of ours, and her startling, uncanny resemblance to my sister Daphne almost confirms this likelihood. My mother once joked that if Daphne wore the same dress, she could be mistaken for the ghost. Fast forward to when all my siblings had finally grown up, and we were married, and my sister Daphne moved to Florida with her lovely husband, and my brother was living in the local area, where he managed another farm. I was still living on the family farm, as my husband Mark was desirous to help my father manage the land and the abundant, thriving hay crop, so we bought the neighbouring farm to enhance the profits of our business. We lived together as an extended family, sharing the large colonial farmhouse together. I was exceedingly happy about this arrangement because I loved living on our family farm and couldn't imagine living anywhere else in the entire world. Imagine my immense amazement when I discovered I was pregnant with twins, and when they were born, they were the biggest bundles of joy in my entire life. One day the most horrifying thing happened, which was every mother's worst nightmare. It would seem that one of my beloved precious twin babies, Diana, simply vanished from her pram on the patio. We believed she'd been abducted. No one had seen sight or sound of anything, but my mother had actually seen a sighting of the ghostly blue lady that day. She quickly scurried away to call my father, so that he could see that the ghost was real. But when she returned with him, the blue lady had all but vanished. Despite an extensive police investigation, my missing daughter could not be found. As you can imagine, words fail to describe how devastated my husband and I were about our grievous, unbearable loss. We were overwhelmed with a hopeless emptiness that consumed our lives like a dark cloud of deep depression that grew bigger every single day. We were glad that we still had one daughter, but nothing could replace the one we had lost, and we couldn't envisage what dreadful fate may have befallen her. Several days later I phoned up my sister Daphne in Florida and told her the dreadful news about what had transpired, and how our precious beloved daughter Diana had seemingly vanished off the face of the earth. "Oh, that's awful," she said. "You've lost your baby. But at least you still have one left. You must be very happy about that," she said, as if she was talking about a packet of cookies that could so easily be replaced. She then randomly piped, "I think I might know what has happened to your baby." "Really?" I said. "What happened to my baby Daphne then?" When my sister spoke like this, I instinctively sensed something was up, and a knowing chill went up my spine, and my blood turned as cold as ice. Daphne continued, "I was thinking that maybe one of Bear's relatives might have pinched her, one of those wild people in the woods." "Why would they do that, Daphne? Why would one of Bear's relatives abduct my baby?" "Well, maybe one of them wanted a human child, especially if they couldn't have kids of their own." "Daphne," I said, "don't play games with me. You stole my baby, didn't you?" I don't know why, but in that instant I just knew Daphne had my baby. Call it a mother's instinct if you like. "What you talking about?" said Daphne defensively. "Why would I do such a ludicrously insane thing like that? I'm in Florida, for goodness sake." "Because, Daphne, you can't have children, that's why." Daphne burst into tears on the phone. "How did you know?" she cried. "You gave yourself away when you started blaming Bear's people for stealing my child. It just seems ridiculous to me, and you were quick to think up an outlandish idea as to how Diana had vanished. People always do that when they have something to hide, or are secretly covering up their guilt." "I'm so sorry, sis. I didn't mean to do it. I wanted a baby so badly. And you had two. It's not fair. Do you have any idea how it feels not to be able to have a baby of my own?" "You get back to the farm and bring back my baby to me right now," I shrieked down the phone, "or there'll be hell to pay. Do you understand, Daphne?" I slammed down the phone with a murderous expression on my face. I was very tempted to call the police and have Daphne arrested on sight. How dare she do this grievously wicked thing to her very own sister? It defied belief. "What on earth is going on?" asked my mother. "You look as white as a sheet." "It was Daphne that stole my baby, Mum," I cried, rushing into her arms and beginning to sob. "How could she do such a terrible thing to me? Does she have any idea the hell I've been through, losing my baby? It's the worst thing that has ever happened to me." My mother gasped. "Oh my God, she didn't do it, did she?" "Oh my God, yes," I said. "I'm going to kill her when she gets here. What she's done is criminal and insane. I can't believe she could be this treacherous to her own flesh and blood." "Don't be too judgmental, dear," said my mother. "You'll be getting your baby back, but your poor sister must have been very desperate to have a child to do such an outrageously crazy thing. She clearly wasn't thinking straight. She saw you had given birth to twins. It must have been incredibly hard for her, knowing that she couldn't even have one for herself. Try putting yourself in her shoes before you rush to judge her too harshly. Look on the bright side. You'll be getting Diana back very soon. It could have been a whole lot worse. At least your sister was Diana's abductor, so at the very least she's in good hands and is safe and well." "That's no excuse, Mum," I screamed. "When she gets here, I'll kill her. Believe me, I will." I remember while I waited for Daphne to finally get to the farm, I was pacing up and down like a hamster on a wheel. My heart was thumping violently in my chest, and the rage I felt was so poignant I could almost taste it in the back of my throat. I wanted to throw all the china around the house and punch someone's lights out. I truly believe I became like a rabid dog foaming at the mouth, as my fury was insatiable. My husband surprised me by being very calm and centred. "You need to forgive Daphne, sweetheart," he piped. "We're getting little Diana back. Is that not what counts? Please don't have a large tantrum when your sister gets here. And don't be mean to her." "Don't be mean to Daphne," I said. "Mark, are you living in the Twilight Zone? She stole our daughter." "We're getting her back, sweetheart," piped Mike, looking at me frustrated. I was going to make my sister pay for what she'd done. But when she did finally arrive at the farmhouse, I grabbed my baby from her and began to sob inconsolably. I was so thrilled to see Diana again. I could see how beautiful she was, and she was oblivious to the little adventure she'd been on. I replaced her into the pram next to her baby sister, and they looked so similar I could hardly tell them apart. I then turned to my sister and screamed, "How could you do this to me? Do you have any idea what you've put me through?" My sister began to sob, and I surprised myself when I took her into my arms, and we embraced, and all my anger subsided in an instant and evaporated as swiftly as the steam from a kettle. I was to learn from Daphne that she had cunningly dressed up in an 1800s blue dress as the ghost of the Blue Lady, in case anyone had seen her, which I thought was rather ingenious, I must say, even in light of the circumstances. My mother had actually seen Daphne that day, falsely assuming her to be the ghost of the Blue Lady. My sister had taken my baby back to Florida, but her husband did not know what she'd done, for he was out of the country for an entire month. I gather she hadn't worked out exactly what she was going to say to him about the new addition to their lives. To cut a long story short, you might be surprised to learn that I completely forgave Daphne for abducting my daughter, as she was my sister after all, and I really loved her. I realised how desperate she was to steal my baby. She informed me that being unable to have children had brought on suicidal feelings of the deepest despair, and on 2 separate occasions she had willingly attempted to end her own life. Daphne was amazed, bewildered and ecstatic when I offered to have a baby for her, using her own husband's sperm. "You would do that for me? You would really do that for me? After everything I've put you through?" "I would do anything for you," I assured her. And so it was I carried Daphne's baby for her for 9 long months, and she was there when I finally delivered a 7-pound 3-ounce baby girl called Grace, as she clearly was a gift from God. So Daphne did end up having her own baby after all. I would have done this for her in a heartbeat, only if she'd asked. Sometimes that's all we really need to do when we're desperate. Just ask. It really is that simple. I'm thrilled to be able to tell you that I did get to see our beloved and precious friend Bear again, one day when I was walking my twins in their pram. That was when I heard a whistle, and I could see this head peeking at me behind a tree, and these deep-set dark eyes sparkling with amusement. I nearly fainted when Bear stepped out of the shadows, because he was so colossal in size, towering at a good 8 foot tall and about 700 pounds, and he was so muscular, burly, lofty, majestic and powerful looking that I was completely dumbfounded. How could he have grown this much? For a while I stood there gawking at my friend in astonishment, for I assure you that he had grown into a critter easily as intimidating and awesome as a lion. He was a sight that would effortlessly have scared off the bravest of men. Yet I was not afraid, for I knew that however threatening the rapper appeared, that it did not reflect the soppy heart of my hairy friend, that I now know to be a Bigfoot. I ran up to Bear and cuddled the oversized teddy bear that smelt like I'd always remembered of the leaves and the dirt. Tears of joy poured down my face like heavy rain, and although he did not physically cry, it was clear that he was emotionally stirred as much as I was. We spent many joyful hours together, walking down the gorgeous woodland trail towards the pretty creek, with a bridge that conjured up so many nostalgic, magical, treasured memories of my childhood, and all the glorious fun times I'd spent with Bear and my siblings. It was a secret oasis, well out of the sight of family members, of whom Bear would wish to avoid, as he had not been acquainted with them, nor did he wish to be either, for despite his friendship with me, he was still reticent and shy by nature. He communicated to me that he was passing through the area, and not staying for very long, but he had a partner and a little female youngling that he expressed were way too shy to meet me, and this did not surprise me or perturb me at all. When Bear finally left, I was sad to see him go, but he reassured me that he would be back, and that if I discovered 3 river stones on the front doorstep, I was then to go and meet him at the bridge by the creek. So since then I've seen him 3 more times when he's visited our area. So there you are. That's my story.
Dear Sarah and all your lovely listeners, my name is Julian, and I grew up as an only child in the bustling, thriving metropolis of the Big Apple of New York City, on the Upper West Side, located in the borough of Manhattan in Lincoln Square. My family live in a stylish red brick apartment block, in close proximity to Central Park. We had a pampered pooch called Muffin that required regular walks there. Half the time my mother carried the cute fluffy white toy Mix in her arms, as she was so terrified of her being torn to shreds by some of the larger, more intimidating dogs in the park. My father worked as a legal attorney in the city near Madison Square, often taking up some high-profile cases from highly esteemed clients, and so he brought home a lucrative, sizable income. He was a very clever man, and my mother was his complete antithesis, but in a strange way the relationship just worked, as opposites most certainly attract. My mother grew up very poor and impoverished, so much so that her family couldn't afford to buy shoes for her when she was a little girl, so she would go running around in her bare feet over the rugged countryside, frequently stabbed by thorny briars and shards of unsuspecting glass. She was born and raised in Tennessee, and had met my father when she took up a job waitressing in a prestigious New York restaurant. My father had been beguiled and bedazzled by my mother's fresh, unblemished innocence and pretty gentle face, with the added benefit that she was easy on the eyes, and reminded him of a gentle doe. He had swept her off her feet, like the quintessential knight in shining armour, and in a second my mother's life was miraculously transformed into a rags-to-riches love story, and the fairy godmother to their magical fairy tale was the hands of fate herself, as her timing was seemingly impeccable, for indeed without her masterful intervention my parents' lives would have never crossed paths. My mother missed her beautiful mountain life in Tennessee that invited so many treasured memories of joyful, uncorrupted times, where the natural landscape had been her playground, and the wild animals her friends, for there were times she expressed such a longing to return to her Appalachian roots, for the mountains and the idyllic landscape were as much as part of her, as indeed the hair was on her head. My father, like any other loving husband, was desirous to make his wife exceedingly happy, and had surreptitiously brought her a charming cottage in the mountains as a gift, and a holiday retreat for the family. I'd never been to Appalachia before, and I falsely assumed that any place outside the vibrant city had to be incredibly boring and tediously dull. I simply adored the exciting buzz of New York, with the yellow taxicabs and the streets teeming with interesting, exciting people. I loved all the shops, the delicatessens, the coffee bars and restaurants, as they were always alive with a hub of activity, and I adored the enthused tones of people's excitable voices. All my wealthy friends went away on fabulously exclusive holidays, like skiing to Aspen, or places abroad like Spain, Portugal, Italy, London and Switzerland, while I was seemingly stuck with going to a mediocre, nondescript mountain town, where nothing exciting would ever happen. Little did I realise how incredibly wrong I was about all that. So there we were in Tennessee, and I could see tears of delight welling up in the corner of my mother's eyes as we drove down a rugged country lane towards the delightful quirky cottage in the midst of the emerald green valley that was situated on a sizable plot of undulating pastoral land that had been managed for our family by a local hillbilly called Huck while we were away, and by the meticulous look of the place he had done an outstanding job in maintenance, and even little Muffin, who was perched on my mother's lap, agreed, for the little toy dog was wagging his tail furiously and yapping non-stop with delight. "Look! Muffin approves of our beautiful cottage," laughed my mother. Our jeep wobbled precariously down the rocky mountain road, basked in the glory of the morning sun that swept the valley in a cheerful light.
We drove down the steep vertical driveway, heavily flanked by tall statuesque trees on the right-hand side, and overlooking exquisite mountain views, and a fetching lake that gleamed in the morning sun like a silvery jewel, reflecting the mountains and the trees that fringed its outer perimeters. It quite literally took my breath away, and I was completely bedazzled and beguiled. "See, I told you it was beautiful here in Appalachia," said my mother, giving me a big wink. "Aspen eats your heart out," she laughed. I was not willing to concede that this magical, enchanting place possessed any merit at all, but I could see there was something magnetically arresting about the mountains that were pulling at my heartstrings. All of a sudden our jeep drew up outside a delightful, whimsical cottage that looked like something that belonged in a magical fairy tale, and not in our physical reality. How could anything be so picture-perfect, I wondered to myself in private, but I wasn't going to express my thoughts to anyone, for I had put much resistance in coming here. I was hardly going to give my mother the satisfaction of admitting that Appalachia was, after all, pretty cool. My mother gasped. "Oh, Gordon," she said, giving my father a huge kiss on the cheek. "It's perfect." The cottage was old and charming, having stood the test of time, as even its walls were steeped in its rich, vibrant history, and that was all embedded in the foundations of the structure that was solidly built, with a stone facade complemented by whitewashed walls and large sash windows, with a colonial-style porch that overlooked ravishing panoramic views of the countryside. This exquisite cottage had belonged to a Tennessee artist from the 1800s, who made very little money during his time on Earth, but now his oils on canvas were highly sought after, as is so often the case, and now worth sizable amounts of money. It was easy to comprehend why this cottage had such aesthetic appeal and character, as the artist had embedded and woven his creative imagination, flair and passion into the very fabric of this cottage. Needless to say, the inside was as enchanting as the outside, as a local interior designer my father had recruited on my mother's behalf had transformed every room into a luxurious, airy sanctuary, using vintage, eclectic influences. It really was stunning. "Oh, my word," said my mother, hugging my father impulsively. "You couldn't have bought me a more magnificent present than this if you'd tried. This cottage is quite literally the most beautiful home I've ever seen in my life. It really is true. The best things do come in small packages." The following afternoon I was eager to explore the countryside, although I didn't want to appear enthusiastic at all. I was magnetically drawn to the steep mountainous wooded area because it was so spectacularly beguiling, as there were flowering bright pink rhododendrons, red buds, tulip trees, along with mountain hemlocks, birch, beeches and sugar maples, and so many more exquisite-looking shrubs. I entered this prepossessing sanctuary, mesmerized by the enchanting birdsong, and that was when I began to hear what I can only describe as a dreadful scuffle, as if someone was engaged in an altercation of some kind. It would seem that I wasn't wrong. "Let me go!" I heard a young male voice crying out indignantly. "Let me go! Let me go! Let me go!" "It's nothing personal, bro. We have to do what we have to do." "Are you going to kill me?" asked the petrified voice. "What have I ever done to you?" I crept closer to the sound of the muffled voices, moving surreptitiously behind a tree. I wanted to find out exactly what was going on. I could see two very strong and seriously intimidating men, young men, dragging a young boy whose arms were oscillating wildly like an octopus and his legs kicking out violently. It was clear he stood no chance in overcoming these powerful combined strength men, as it would have been like punching a brick wall. Completely and utterly useless. "Are you going to kill me?" screamed the young boy. "I need to know. You have to tell me." One of the men pulled out a revolver and pointed it directly at the young man, whose eyes grew as round as saucers and registered extreme terror. He began to shake and tremble, and tears poured down his cheeks. It was so dreadful to watch. "Please, please, please don't hurt me," he begged. "Please, no. I beg. Please don't shoot me. I'll do anything. I'll do anything. Anything you say. I'll do it. I promise." At that, one of the burly men pulled out a white T-shirt covered with what looked like bright red bloodstains. "Put this on," he said, tossing the T-shirt to the terrified boy, who quickly, obediently obeyed. "What's going on?" he cried, throwing off his T-shirt and replacing it with the soiled T-shirt covered in blood. "Why do you want me to wear this? What's going on? I need to know what is going on." The man was still pointing his revolver at the boy. "I want you to sit up against the tree on the ground, understand? Now," he commanded. "Tie the boy up, Donovan," he said to his brother. "Now. Do it now." I watched in horror as Donovan proceeded to tie the boy up against the tree so that he would never be able to get away or escape. I was absolutely appalled. What in God's name was going on? "What are you doing to me?" the boy protested. "Please tell me, what the heck is going on? I don't understand any of this. It makes no sense to me. What have I done?" The man with the rifle said, "Marvin Watson. He wants you dead. I'm afraid that he's offered us big bucks to kill you, sonny boy. More than you can afford to pay us to get out of this mess you've got yourself into. And the man is minted, as you may well know." "Marvin Watson wants me dead?" asked the boy, looking bewildered. "Are you sure you haven't got your wires crossed? That's Noel Watson's brother, isn't it?" "The very same," said the large man. "He asked us to tie you up to a tree and to shoot you dead in the heart at point-blank range. He'll be coming into the woods shortly to inspect that we have done our job adequately. If you don't manage to play dead convincingly enough for him, he will shoot you himself in the head. We don't want your death on our conscience. We're not murderers, so don't judge us harshly for this, but we need the money desperately. Our mother requires expensive medical treatment for her cancer. We've not got any choice in this matter. We've given you the best chance of fooling Marvin for yourself with this blood-soaked T-shirt. We don't get paid until he sees that you're dead and he's satisfied with his own eyes. So he better not see you breathing, or you're dead. Do you understand? It's not my responsibility if you can't deceive him yourself." "I don't understand. Why does he want me dead so badly?" stammered the young boy. "You mean you don't know?" said the larger man, looking perturbed. "But you always win the dirt bike mountain cross every single year. It's been 3 years in a row now, and Marvin's brother Neil always comes in second place. So Marvin wants the competition eliminated, and you're his competition, so his brother can win. I told you, it's not personal." "Look," begged the boy, "I'll do anything. You can tell Marvin I'll never enter the dirt bike mountain cross ever again. But please, please, let me go." "Marvin warned us that you would try negotiating with us to get out of this pickle. But sorry, it's no. You'll probably saunter off to the sheriff and dob him in, and he's not having any of that." "I won't say anything to anyone, I promise," begged the boy. "Look, my lips are shut. Do I look like I'm talking? I'm not a snitch, never have been and never will be." "I told you," said the man. "Negotiations are off the table." "So what are you going to do if I successfully play dead and Marvin sees that you never finish what you started? What if I got to the police after all this is over? You could end up embroiled in this whole mess yourselves and become accomplices to murder." "Why should we care?" said the man. "We'll have been paid off, and that's all that matters, because all we care about is that my mother gets her money for her cancer treatments. Besides, if Marvin ends up in prison for attempted murder, he only gets what he deserved. He's a nasty piece of work anyway. We're guilty of nothing but tying you up, and that's all. And we'll also deny that it even happened." The men turned around to leave. "Please, please, I beg you, don't go. I'm so afraid. I mean, if you leave me tied up all night to this tree, a bobcat will get me. Can you not see? I'm a sitting duck for a wild animal. How could I ever fight back?"
"That's the risk we have to take," said Donovan. "We'll come to free you from the tree tomorrow afternoon, once the dirt bike race is completed, and Neil has won his prize. I'm very sorry that we do have to do this to you. We both are sorry. As I said, it's nothing personal. We promise you that. Let's hope, like Daniel in the lion's den, you can sew up the bobcat's mouth. We'll keep you in our prayers tonight. Good luck." "When is Marvin coming?" asked the young boy, looking terrified. "Any minute now," said the tall man. "So you better start practicing playing dead." I was absolutely appalled. I couldn't believe what I'd just witnessed. Could it be real? I had arrived in a small mountain town and observed more drama in a few minutes than in a lifetime of living in New York City. It was like I was engaged in a movie unfolding before my very eyes. I was disgusted and revolted that someone wanted this poor boy dead, just to eliminate his brother's competition. Could people be that pathetic and shallow? Could they be that small-minded? All of a sudden I heard someone coming. Oh my goodness, I thought. It must be the man, the Marvin fellow, to check whether the boy is dead. I hope the boy can pull this off, I thought. I wasn't convinced by any manner of means that feigning one's own death would be easy. I frantically searched for a large stone to throw at the man. I literally had to do something to help the boy, if things did get out of hand, which was highly likely. I watched a hefty, thuggish-looking man, rather a rough diamond, I have to say, with a face like a robber's dog, walking towards the tree where the young boy was tied up, trying desperately to act dead. From what I could discern, he was doing a great job, but could he fool this discerning man? Marvin squatted down on his heavily muscular legs while he studied the corpse, very deliberately, with one of his large hands ominously fiddling with the revolver in his holty. I was so terrified that my heart was beating so fast I could feel the vibration of every single heartbeat, and my forehead was sweating profusely, so much so that water was dripping down my face like heavy raindrops. "Sorry, mate," said Marvin, pulling the revolver out of his holty. "You're not going to be winning any more competitions any time soon. Not at my brother's expense, you're not. And by the looks of you, I would say you could do with another bullet to your head, just to be sure. I knew these dudes would have trouble finishing you off. When you want something done properly, you need to do it yourself." "Stop! No! You can't do that! No! No, you can't!" I began hurling stones at Marvin's back. All of a sudden, the shocked man swiveled around, looking for where I was hiding, and began firing indiscriminately in my direction. "I can see you lurking there behind the tree," he shrieked. "You are a dead boy." Marvin began running around the trees, searching for me frantically. In a trice, he had stealthily tracked me down, pouncing on me unaware like a lion dragging down its prey. And he dragged me, kicking and screaming with all my life, to the tree. I was now seated next to the boy, and I was almost certainly going to have a bullet put in my head in any second. I could hardly believe what was transpiring, as everything seemed so surreal, almost as if this was a part I was playing in a movie. Yet I knew in my gut that this was no screenplay. Yes, it was really happening, and it was happening to me. "Who the heck are you?" said Marvin, pointing his revolver at me. "Answer me, boy. Who are you? How do you know James Turner?" "I don't know him," I said. "I just care about human life. And you can't go killing someone just because they beat your brother in a race. You know how pathetic that is? It's ridiculous." "It's ridiculous, is it?" said Marvin, running his hands suggestively down his revolver. "It's ridiculous that I want Neil to get first place. It's ridiculous that I want America to win in the sports. It's ridiculous, is it?" "Yes, it's ridiculous," I said. "It's not human to want to kill someone. You're not human." "Not human, is that right?" Marvin snarled. "You're not from around here, are you? You sound a little hoity-toity and stuck up. Where you from, boy?" "New York," I said. Marvin spat on the ground in disgust. "That's what I think of New York, posh boy," he said. Any last words, posh boy, because I'm going to blow your skull apart in any second, so think quickly on your feet. And if you've got a god, you better pray hard, because I'm about to blow your brains out. I nearly died of shock when Marvin suddenly fired a couple of bullets only yards away from me. He clearly meant business. I began to scream at the top of my lungs so incredibly loudly, and the boy beside me joined in. I think he'd realised that the game was well and truly up, and that his clever masquerade had clearly not worked. I believe our screams were so vociferous and so ear-piercing, they travelled through the forest like an ambulance siren, alerting anyone in close proximity that someone was in serious trouble. And somehow the forest heard our call. Marvin laughed viciously. Ha 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 ha! He was heartily enjoying scaring us half to death, but I was in no doubt he was going to kill us. I watched in horror as he reloaded his rifle, and his intentions were very clear, as I perceived a very stiff tightening of his jawbone, and a very intentional squint in his eyes, as he focused on the job at hand. All of a sudden, I heard something bolting through the woods, and the thundering sound was so ominously menacing that even Marvin was distracted by the major commotion. "What the heck?" he said, looking towards the trees. "What the heck is that?" A large silhouette or dark shadowy form came charging towards us like a rocket. It loomed ever closer, and the largest creature you have ever seen materialized before our very eyes. I realized at once that this was the legendary beast known as Bigfoot. Could this drama unfolding before my eyes get any more outlandish or bizarre? The critter stopped dead in its tracks, and I was gobsmacked by the gargantuan size of this thing, as it was built like a giant. It was agile and powerful, towering at about 8 foot tall, 700 pounds, and 3 foot wide across the shoulder area. The creature was female. She possessed small breasts and was covered in long, flowing auburn hair with blonde highlights. Her pyramid-shaped head flowed into her shoulders seamlessly, and if there was a neck, it was very well covered. In my opinion, her face was so human, it was almost uncanny, and I could see that in seconds her very dark, intelligent eyes had immediately assessed the situation, and she was not amused. I could see her look at Marvin with an expression of distinct distaste and unequivocal rage on her face. She was not amused, far from it, in fact. Marvin looked terrified. His hands began to shake and wobble, and he began to fire precariously at the creature, but she bounced out of the way with every single shot. She then snatched the revolver from Marvin with a brute force, throwing it into the thick brush, with a look of revulsion on her face. Then she picked up Marvin, who she despised because in her eyes he was the most grotesque thing she'd ever seen. She lifted his body into the air, impaling his central torso by thrusting it through the jagged branch of a tree. For a second Marvin was still conscious and gurgled with blood that bubbled up in his throat, and then he died, with his eyes glazed over, staring at us like a dead fish. It happened so quickly. Too quickly to believe it was real. The female Bigfoot turned her attention towards us for a moment, and she had such a matriarchal look in her eyes that seemed so warm, congenial, and kind. It was almost like she had a grandmother spirit about her, and it was as if she was trying to say, "Are you all right?" We were not afraid, for it was clear that she meant us no harm. Her demeanour couldn't have been more gentle. She then turned around to walk away, and we called after her, "Thank you, thank you." And she glanced at us one more time very briefly, with a warm, congenial expression on her face, and we watched her glide away into the heart of the woods. I quickly untied the boy, and the two of us embraced, hugging each other with relief, even though we were just strangers. "She saved our lives," I said. "That beautiful, majestic Bigfoot, the creature of legend, saved our lives." "That's for sure." "But so did you," said the boy. "If you hadn't stuck out your neck for me, I would almost certainly be dead, and that's a sure thing. It was really gutsy of you throwing stones at Marvin like that. I'm not sure I'd have had the same kind of courage. If you hadn't distracted him, I would almost certainly have a bullet in my head right now. Anyone would have done the same, I said. Are you kidding? You're a hero. By the way, I'm James Turner. I'm Julian Jeffries, I told him. He deserves all he gets, I said in disgust, regarding Marvin's dead corpse that was impaled on the tree limb with extreme dispassion. Let's leave him out here for the bobcats to eat, shall we? Come with me back to my cottage. I'd like to introduce you to my parents. To cut a very long story short, James Turner and I became the very best of friends, and we still are today. We met in the most unlikely of circumstances, so indeed the hands of fate also played a hand in our acquaintance. It must have been only a few days after Marvin's death, when I was rummaging around in the attic of the old cottage, where I found a painting that had belonged to the dead artist that had once resided in our home. It was almost like a gift. I also discovered it was worth a tidy sum of money, so James and I decided to pay an impromptu visit to Donovan's mother, the poor lady who had cancer and required expensive treatment. The pale, sickly-looking, emaciated woman invited us into her house, and we offered her the painting, telling her it was to cover all the costs of her cancer treatment, and she was astonished and dumbfounded by our kindness. "But why? I don't understand. Why would you help me? You don't even know me," she asked. "You'd be surprised the lengths that some people will go to in order to help those they love," said James. "You mean my sons?" asked the lady. "Do they have a hand in this?" "Of course they do," said James, in a manner of speaking. Imagine the shocked looks on Donovan and his brother Teddy's face when they returned to the house to find James Turner and I seated with their mother having tea together very happily. Their mother was wearing a thrilled expression on her face. "Look what these lovely young boys have done for me," said their mother. "They've both given me this painting to cover the cost of my cancer treatment. Can you believe their kindness?" "Yes, that is very kind," said Teddy. "This is the legendary James Turner," said the mother to her sons. "The champion on the dirt bike. You know the one. And this is Julian Jeffries. He brought the artist cottage as a holiday home with his family." "We know James Turner," said the boys, nodding awkwardly at James. And to me they said, "Nice to finally meet you, Julian." Once their mother was out of earshot, the two boys sheepishly approached James. "Sorry, bro," they said, "about everything that happened back in those woods. I don't think I can forgive myself for what happened." "Forget it," said James. "It's over and done with now." "How did you manage to escape after we tied you up?" asked Donovan. "When we saw you were gone, we did fear the worst and were very aggrieved. We realized we'd gone way too far, and we are truly sorry." "What happened to Marvin?" "We saw him impaled on the tree, and so we surreptitiously moved his body to a place where he could be found, so his family could mourn his loss. His body was in an appalling, dreadful state. Never seen anything so grisly in my entire life. What the heck happened to him? He was such a mess." "That's very nice of you," said James. "What I mean is that you moved his body. Personally, I would have left him for the bobcats to enjoy. Come to think of it, he might have been too bitter for them to stomach." "I can understand your grievances," said Donovan. "But what happened to the man? Seriously?" "It was a bear," said James. "Thought it might have been," said Donovan. "That was quite some atrocious way to die. What about you? How did you escape?" "You wouldn't believe me if I told you," said James. "Thanks again, bro," said Teddy, "for helping my mother. I mean, you have no idea what it means to the both of us." "Oh, believe me, I think I do," said James. "I really think I do. You went to great lengths on her account, way beyond the realms of what is reasonable." "You know the funny thing about it all," said Donovan. "Marvin's brother came in 8th on the dirt bike race. So good job Marvin's not alive to see it, as he went to so much trouble trying to eliminate his brother's competition. Next time he'd have to eliminate 9 boys." 3 weeks after this curious event, we were on our 2-hour flight to New York, and my mother turned around to me and said, "Sweetheart, what did you think of Tennessee?"
And our cottage in Appalachia. I meant to ask you about that. If you mean, was it as good as Aspen, I asked. That's exactly what I mean, my mother asked me. It was way, way better, I said, with lots of drama, just the way I like it. My mother smiled. Didn't I tell you, dear? Appalachia has a way of getting under your skin. You can't let go of it. I know I can't, and I see it's had that effect on you too. So there you are. That's my story. Dear Sarah and all your lovely listeners, my name is Clyde, and I grew up in the early 80s in Charleston, West Virginia, with my sister Ava and both of my parents, where we lived in a green leafy neighbourhood. As children, we often spent our weekends with my grandmother, who lived in a very regal-looking federal-style farmhouse on a substantial expanse of land that she let out to other farmers in the area for grazing purposes, so invariably you would always see sheep or cows grazing the verdant pastoral land. As kids, we relished every moment we spent on the farm. As for me personally, I found being out in nature to be the most edifying, uplifting experience of my life. It was like I felt I could breathe again. I felt unshackled and liberated, rather like a cat that had been released from the confines of its tiny drab cage. I would stretch out my legs, breathe in the rich oxygen-filled air, and alongside Ava, I would go exploring the countryside, running through fields of sagebrush, flowery meadows, and into vast areas of wood-green, where we would enter a shaded retreat, which on our farm consisted of ancient sequoia groves, redwoods, and a scattering of lodgepole pines. And when I say these trees were old, I assure you they had stood on our farm for hundreds of years, and seen through generations of the Sinclair family. The one thing I can tell you without a doubt is the older trees become, the more magnificent they are. So you can only imagine the regal prominence of these towering statuesque masterpieces that towered up into the heavens like heroical skyscrapers. Every time I explored the woodgrove, I was always drawn to touching their masterful trunks, for they beheld an invisible energy that grounded me and anchored me to my life, as I did have the propensity to be ever so slightly flighty. I cannot remember all the games my sister and I played in the countryside together, but believe me, they were many. The natural world always managed to hold our attention with a wondrous sense of awe. It could be a frog hopping around the edge of the stream, or a deer that crossed our path, stopping for a moment to regard us ever so curiously through the gentlest eyes, and then quickly scurrying off. One day as my sister and I were having breakfast on my grandmother's pretty patio that overlooked exquisite panoramic views of the resplendent emerald-green countryside, all of a sudden we observed this mysterious dark silhouette seamlessly gliding towards the farmhouse and hesitantly stopping a few yards away from the porch. The critter stood very still, but let out a shrill whistle that rather reminded me of a bird call that I was rather acquainted with. Ava and I were astonished by what we were beholding. It was a giant-sized woman covered with long, flowing dark brown hair, with overlong arms and powerful legs. I would estimate she was easily 8 foot tall, 700 pounds, and her shoulders were approximately 3 foot wide. "Oh, that's Peppercorn," said my grandmother. "She's very reserved and shy, because you're here with me. She's not comfortable with strangers, which is why she's keeping a safe distance from us. I'm afraid she's not socially inclined." "Why has she got hair all over her body, Grandma?" I asked. "Oh, Peppercorn," my grandmother laughed. "She's hairy because she's a wild woman. And how do you suppose she keeps warm without clothes? Nature has adorned her with a glorious coat." That made absolute sense to me, so I watched curiously as my mother approached Peppercorn with a basket of goodies that contained a large jar of honey, a bottle of milk, a loaf of baked bread, some cinnamon and raisin cookies, and a large bag of apples from the orchards. I could see that Peppercorn was carrying a wild turkey in her hands, and they exchanged goods, and the wild woman just glided away, looking very happy by the exchange. "It's called bartering," said my grandmother proudly, "which is something they do all the time in the Middle East when they exchange things. Look at the size of this thing," she said. "Peppercorn is quite the hunter. My grandmother was examining the turkey with a rather animated, thrilled look upon her face. "This is going to taste absolutely delicious for dinner," she said. "Anyone fancy helping me pluck the feathers out?" "I'll help you," I said eagerly. One night when we were staying on my grandmother's farm, we heard what I can only describe as a random gunshot, followed a little later by some high-pitched screams that sounded exactly like a woman being murdered. But we continued to sleep, seemingly unperturbed by the distractions of the dusky night, where the wind blew ominously through the trees, sometimes whistling, moaning and howling, often accompanied by the most anomalous, outlandish sounds of nature, which my grandmother always told us was probably just geese or coyotes. As for gunshots, they were not uncommon either in this part of the world, as sometimes people engaged in night hunting for coyotes or coons. However, I was startled when I heard a loud whacking sound at the front door in the middle of the night, along with a piercing whistle. Ava sat up in bed, looking startled. "What's going on?" she asked. "Don't look at me," I said, throwing on my gown and slippers and sliding down the banisters like a fireman on a pole, eager to see what on earth was going on. My grandmother was dressed in her nightgown, peered through the peephole of the door, and then unleashed the chain and opened it. We could see the large, hairy wild woman, looking frantic and discomposed by something, pointing towards the woods and imitating someone with a gun. Oh dear, sighed my grandmother. "Poachers again," she said, shaking her head furiously and reaching for her rifle. "Let's get rid of these hooligans," she exclaimed. In a trice she was walking side by side with the wild woman into the heart of the wood green. She didn't realise that I was trailing behind her, but the wild woman most certainly knew, as she glanced back at me with her deep-set dark eyes that were alert to everything and missed nothing. I was eager to find out what had transpired, and to my astonishment we discovered a young woman lying on the ground, soaked in her own blood. She seemed to be mumbling. I was glad to see she was still alive. My grandmother indicated to Peppercorn to carry the strange woman, as we didn't have any time to lose. Peppercorn swiftly lifted the woman effortlessly into her arms, as if she was as light as a feather, gliding back to the house as speedily as a cheetah, with the grace of a ballerina and the dexterity of a mountain goat. My grandmother indicated for Peppercorn to place the girl on the kitchen table. Peppercorn stood and watched with us as my grandmother worked speedily on the girl, stopping the bleeding and removing the bullet from her leg. It was quite a masterful procedure, but my grandmother was quick and skillful with her hands, working speedily to retrieve the bullet and to stop the bleeding, while the poor woman whimpered and moaned in pain with a cloth stuffed in her mouth to help her bite instead of scream out. Finally, my grandmother poured alcohol over the open wound to sterilize it. "You'll live," she told the woman. "You're very lucky the bullet missed your main artery. You could have been a goner." "She saved my life," said the woman, pointing towards Peppercorn. "Delish was going to fire at me a second time, but she stopped him." Peppercorn, suddenly beginning to feel rather self-conscious by all the attention being lavished upon her, nodded at us ever so briefly and glided away out of the house towards the woods. I could see she was terribly shy, but I loved her demeanour, as she exuded a gentle, humble kind of energy, and I was secretly impressed that she had saved this young woman's life. Once the young woman had regained her strength, she told us exactly what had transpired, and my grandmother insisted she wanted to hear the story from the very beginning. "Don't leave anything out," she said. "I can't abide stories without a beginning, middle and end, because then they're not stories at all. You need to understand the beginning to make sense of the end." I interceded. "My granny means you mustn't say the cat sat on the wall. The end," I said. "You must explain why the cat was on the wall in the first place. Why did he get there? And where did he go in the end? What happened?" "Very well," said the woman. "I think I get the general gist of what you're trying to say. My name is Fiona Fullington, and I'm from Charleston, Virginia." "Me too," I piped, "and so is Ava, my sister. Well, I work in the ladies' fashion department as a buyer at the department store. This is where I met Adesh Patel, who ran a local line of eclectic vintage designer clothes that we were buying for the store. It was my job to meet up with him regularly to discuss the individualistic clothing that was made in India with the Western-like influences to it. They had inspired a growing demand from all our customers for the collection. One day it was raining quite badly outside the Italian restaurant where Adesh and I were having coffee, discussing my next order for the department store, and Adesh was advising me on what exactly to order. Rather than getting completely soaked, he suggested we stay on at the restaurant for some pasta and salad until finally the rain subsided, and that's what we did. It seemed like a great idea at the time. My family is from Bombay in India. I was the only one really raised in America, although I go back to Bombay very regularly. We have a house here in Charleston, and a large apartment in Bombay, he told me. You could say we do a great deal of commuting for the business, as some of our materials can only be brought in India. That's why your clothes are so unique, and they're flying off the shelves like hotcakes. Everybody loves them. May I trouble you for some advice? Adesh interjected. I just wouldn't mind somebody else's opinion on this personal matter that concerns me greatly. Try me, I said, but I can't promise to be very knowledgeable. Well, my parents have planned an arranged marriage for me next month, with a girl from a highly esteemed, rather prominent high-class Indian family in Bangladesh. Brinda is her name, and she's a very beautiful young woman, whom I was fortunate enough to meet a couple of times before the big day. That's nice, I said. She sounds delightful. What's the problem? The trouble is, when I met her, I felt absolutely nothing. There was no spark, no connection, no electricity, if you know what I mean. No, I'm not sure I actually do. I don't think people who get embroiled in so-called arranged marriages are necessarily attracted to each other at first, I said. From what I gather, it's a growing relationship, rather like something you plant that eventually germinates into love. It needs to be watered and nurtured before it eventually blossoms, just like anything does. That's the trouble. I don't believe I could ever grow to love her. How do you know that? I piped. You barely know her, Adesh. Give the poor girl a fighting chance. It's like you're being judge, jury and prosecutor before even knowing what she's all about. I think you're being exceedingly unreasonable. I don't like her at all, said Adesh, and I know that sounds preposterous and unreasonable, but it's true. In fact, from the very second I met her, I disliked her intensely. And the moment she spoke, her squeaky voice was so annoying it went through me like a resounding bell. I couldn't imagine waking up to that caterwauling, maddening voice every morning. It would drive me insane and do my head in. I did get a private investigator to find out more about her, and I was to discover that even her friends describe her as a spiteful bitch. Are you being serious? You got a private investigator to find out all about her character? Yes, I'm afraid I did. I had this gut-wrenching feeling that marrying her would be a grievous mistake on my part, and it seems I wasn't wrong. Whew, the feedback I'm getting on her character is less than favourable. She's described as like a candy bar, attractive and alluring on the outside, but the taste of the candy is as bitter as gall. Well, then don't marry her, Adesh. If you feel such revulsion towards her, wild dogs in hell wouldn't drag me down the aisle if I were wearing your shoes. You need to tell your parents exactly how you feel about her. I'm sure they'd understand. That's the problem. They're not going to be terribly happy with me, because there are hundreds of eligible wealthy bachelors in India dreaming to marry the very same girl. I mean, she comes from a very upmarket premier family, I might add. Well, let them, I said. Let them. Just let it not be you. Before long, Adesh and I were meeting up rather regularly, and as was expected, his parents were less than agreeable with Adesh's refusal to marry Brinda. He would phone me regularly, asking me to meet him to discuss the next instalment of family drama that was far more gripping, rousing and stirring than anything J.R. Ewing was doing in Dallas. I was riveted by the soap opera or situation comedy unfolding in Adesh's life. I sensed he was using every excuse in the book to see me, and I rather liked that. I'd get this flutter in my heart during our private little rendezvous. I'd never met anyone like Adesh before. He was Western thinking, but with American influences and exotic Indian edges to his personality that was very refreshing and endearing. If that wasn't alluring enough, he was handsome, charming and kind, and I guess we just connected on every single level, and I sensed he was feeling that spark like electricity between us. And then, "You fell in love," said my grandmother, finishing the sentence. "That's right, we fell in love, and Adesh asked me to marry him. I could hardly believe it. Well, he informed his family that he'd chosen a woman outside his culture to marry, and that went down like a lead balloon, I imagine," said my grandmother. "Oh dear, oh dear, oh dear," she tutted to herself. "Exactly," said Fiona. "Well, Adesh and I made the wedding arrangements for next Saturday. Last Tuesday his father Delish approached me with a huge wad of bribery cash to persuade me not to marry his son. But obviously that was not going to work. "Please do not marry my son," said Delish. "He does not know what he wants. He thinks he's in love with you, but what does he know? At his age, he is a fool for marrying outside his culture and tradition. It is a disgrace. I do not want him to marry you. You are not the right woman." "I'm so sorry, Delish. I wish I could do what you want me to do, but I just love your son, and my decision is absolutely final. I'm not going to change my mind about marrying him. We love each other. We can't change the way we feel about each other. I'm so sorry."
"You will regret the day that you ever laid eyes on Delish," said his father, glaring at me venomously, leaving the shop looking less than amused. Imagine my surprise when Adesh actually phoned me and told me that his parents had literally changed their minds about me and were so delighted to welcome me into their family, and somehow he'd managed to talk his parents around, and now they were very happy about our wedding. Earlier on in the day I went to their home in Charleston for lunch, and Adisha's parents were fussing around me and treating me like the Queen of Sheba. They were offering to do this and that for my wedding. Adisha and I were astonished by the complete turnaround in attitude on their part. I guess we were exceedingly naive and ignorant to have believed their flawless charade. Fiona continued, "There's a woman who lives in this neck of the woods. For all I know, it could be the next farm down or something. Well, she makes personalised jewellery, and she's actually making me a bracelet for my wedding day. And I happened to mention that I needed to pick up the jewellery after dinner. She told me that I couldn't come later than 8:30 this evening, and so that was what I was planning to do." "Oh, you mean Judith Thornbury? I know her very well," said my grandmother. "She's been making stunning jewellery all her life. She does make some incredibly stunning pieces." "That's right, Judith Thornbury, that's her name. Well, believe it or not, Delicia's father said it would be a privilege to take me to pick up the jewellery, and then to take me back home to Charleston. He said it was the least he could do, since he'd treated me so deplorably. It would seem we were having such a pleasant drive in the countryside, talking away happily together. Little did I realise that I was being led away like a lamb to the slaughter by this guileful, duplicitous man." "I changed my mind about you. You are good for my son. I see that now. I know the two of you will be very happy together." "Thanks, Delish. You don't know what hearing you say that means to me. I thought you were never going to accept me in your family. We thought we might have to elope and get married in Vegas," I piped. I could perceive the corner of Delicious' jaw clenching ever so tightly, and his dark eyes almost squinting at me like a bull terrier. Then he looked at me directly. "That would have been a very, very stupid thing to do. You know, families need to talk about their problems and reach resolutions so that things and issues can be resolved. Running into the sunset would never have been the answer to that situation. Look, we've sorted the problem out now, so there is nothing to worry about anymore." Delish pulled over to the side of the rugged dirt road in a remote area surrounded by forest, and then he parked his car. "Is there something wrong?" I asked. "Oh, no, there is something very wrong with the car. I don't know, but did you not feel the way the car was not running as well as it normally does?" "I didn't notice anything." Delish then pulled his rifle out of the pocket and thrust it against my head. "Get out of my car now, or I will blow your head right off. Do you hear me?" I asked him, "Delish, what's going on? What are you doing?" You think I'm going to allow a Western woman to marry my Amish? That is never, ever going to happen, because I won't ever let it. Did I not warn you that this would not end well? But did you listen? Of course you did not. You do not understand my culture. We do not appreciate Western women interfering with our children. It's not right. Do you not understand? Now you are going to pay for your bad choices. I warned you about this, did I not? I knew in that instant that Amisha's father was going to murder me. There was no question of a doubt about that in my mind, and so I began to sprint towards the woods as fast as I could. I was filled with terror. I don't think I've ever been so afraid about anything in my entire life. He ran after me, firing random shots at me, and in a fleeting second I felt the searing heat shooting into my leg, and it began to ache and throb as I ran and ran. Suddenly I realized that my leg was very wet, and I noticed drops of blood everywhere. I'd been shot. I continued to run with a powerful adrenaline surge, but after a while I just collapsed onto the ground from the pain in my legs and the weakness I suddenly felt. I glanced up towards the grinning face that was staring down at me. Delish looked thrilled to see me incapacitated like this. Didn't take much to get you down. An Indian girl would have had a lot more spunk than you. I told you, you weren't right for my son. Goodbye now, because it's all over for you. I squeezed my eyes tight because his rifle was pointed directly at my head, and I knew I was powerless to escape. I was literally at this man's mercy, and he had none. I just hoped it would be quick, but nothing happened. I opened my eyes, and then I heard Delish screaming, and I looked up to see this wild, hairy woman throwing Delish into the air like he was a frisbee, tossing him up and down in her huge hands. And I promise you that humongous-sized creature made Delish look pathetically small and thin, like a Barbie doll, and he's not a small man by any manner of means. I think the creature was so angry with him because she was screaming at him, and her screams were so shrill they literally reverberated through my chest. I watched in awe as the creature carried Delish over her back like a sack of potatoes towards the stream, hurling him down the embankment, where I could hear him hit the water with a loud thud. "Well, that was quite some story, Fiona," said my grandmother. "I'm just so thankful you're alive." To cut a long story short, I was to learn that Delish did end up making a trip to the jeweller's house, as he had promised, but not quite in the way he would have envisaged, because it was his deceased body that arrived washed up on the edge of the stream on Judith Thornbury's property. I gather the coroner believed Delish had hit his head, been knocked unconscious, and accidentally drowned. It was ruled just as an accident. I'm very glad to inform you that Fiona did end up marrying the love of her life, Adish, and they're very happy together, with 2 children of their own. And they live in Canada now, and they are estranged from his immediate family. Fiona gave my grandmother the bracelet that she had designed by Judith as a gift. In her gratitude to Peppercorn for saving her skin, Fiona and Adish bought her the largest basket of gifts that you've ever seen in your life. Peppercorn was over the moon about the gifts, that she kept whooping and whooping with delight. It was hysterical to watch her. We could also hear other whooping sounds from the woods that night, so I imagine the family must have been equally as enthralled with all the presents, as much as she was. But we've never been privy to actually meeting any of them, because my grandmother told me once that they were more evasive than Peppercorn, and that is saying something. Fiona bought Peppercorn a very strong leather thong, a necklace made for a giant, with a very attractive aquamarine stone at the end of it. I gather Amish went to visit a medium, who told him exactly what Peppercorn would like, and judging by her incredible reaction to the aquamarine stone, it was right on the money. The other gifts were literally food items, and there were so many of them, I can't even remember them all. But the ones that stick out were the peanut butter, the honey, the bags of nuts, the dried fruits, the fresh fruit, the grapes, the cookies, and the jerky. In the years that passed, I would sometimes see Peppercorn, and she was always wearing her aquamarine jewel so proudly around her neck. My grandmother sadly died about 20 years ago, and the farm was subsequently sold off. But as far as I know, Peppercorn's descendants may indeed be wandering around that valley, and now I know the critters are known to be Bigfoots. So there you are. That's my story.
Dear Sarah, and all your lovely listeners, my name is James Rotherfield, and I'm from North America, where I grew up in an idyllic farm very close to a charming rural town. I don't wish to give you my geographic location for the very purposes of remaining anonymous, most especially because I know they're benevolent, gentle Bigfoots still living in the wooded area of my property that deserve to live out their lives in peace. I grew up in the 70s, and I was so fortunate to be raised on a farm surrounded by the natural wonders of nature. Our enchanting, sizable 1800s farmhouse had been in the Rotherfield family for generations, and was to be passed down to the eldest son in the family line by way of inheritance. I would invariably end up ploughing the land on our family farm, much like my father had done, and my grandfather before him, where we grew a very successful corn and wheat crop. I must admit our prepossessing historical farmhouse, where I still live today, was quite literally the ideal place to raise kids, as the house itself had so many exciting nooks and crannies for children to discover. It was airy and spacious, with spectacular views over the verdant countryside. I had 2 sisters, both younger than myself, and their feminine influence on my life was a huge positive. It helped me to develop the more sensitive side to my character. As kids, we pretty much did everything together as a rather formidable, forceful team. We climbed trees, rode our bicycles, including my parents' horses that were stabled on our farm, and last but not least, we spent copious amounts of time in the wood green. It would seem that we were always drawn to this magnetic, shaded retreat that was so spectacularly beautiful. It's difficult to explain to you how beguiling this place was, but I assure you, if you had seen it for yourself, you would have understood the alluring attraction. My mother once told me that an ancestor on our father's side of our family was an artist, and he spent every day of his life in the wood green because it was so magnetically arresting, and all he ever did was just paint the trees, and his work was outstanding. If the trees were spectacular in his lifetime, imagine what they were like when I was young. On our farm we had some ancient redwood trees, oaks, walnuts and maples, and they were quite literally giants that were hundreds of years old. And these imposing, regal-looking skyscrapers towered up into the sky with such a graceful repose, providing a magnificent shaded canopy that was a haven for all kinds of indigenous and intriguing wildlife on our land. And we had everything from whitetails to raccoons, rabbits, squirrels, bobcats and coyotes. There was also a very beguiling stream that zigzagged through the wood grove, and a magnificent waterfall that thundered over a rocky outcrop, with a resplendent display of white foaming water that jetted over the rocks with a forceful, invigorating current. I do remember we adored paddling over the pebbles in the shallow part of the stream, as the moving water, along with the pebbles beneath our feet, act as a massage. One day my sisters and I were playing hide-and-seek in the woods, where our eyes were suddenly drawn to 2 peculiar, rather lumpy forms lying under a large oak tree, that at first we thought were bags of potatoes. Imagine our shock when we discovered that the bags of potatoes were bodies of 2 deceased men that looked like they'd been flogged within an inch of their lives before they had finally met their deadly fate, which looked ominously like a single shot to the head. There were long vertical lash marks all over their naked torsos, where their skin had been torn and shredded apart, almost ripped if you like. As kids, it was alarming and disturbing for us to behold this horrendous, despicable sight, as this was the first time we'd ever seen a deceased human body before, and in this case there were 2 of them. The 2 corpses looked like white mannequins that had been thickly layered in stage paint to intensify the graphic visual effects of the deep bruising that was in bright purples and blues and yellows. It was indisputable to all 3 of us that these bodies were not stage props at all, for we discerned that they were definitely real. Even the eyes of the bodies were blackened by bruises and almost half shut from the swelling where they had conspicuously been punched very brutally. Both corpses were missing digits from their fingers and toes on their feet, which was in itself peculiarly odd. As kids, we were very alarmed and startled by what we were beholding, but also fascinated at the same time. We quickly ran home to tell our parents what we had discovered. But when we returned to the wood green with both of our parents, the bodies had mysteriously just vanished. I could see my mother giving my father that exasperated, knowing look, as she rolled her eyes at the back of her head, which implied that she believed we were making up fictitious stories just to get attention.
"But the bodies were here a moment ago," I assured them. "We saw them for ourselves. I promise you, they were real." "Well, where are they, son?" asked my father. "Kids," he said, "it's not funny to make up serious stories like this. Have you ever heard the story of the boy that cried wolf too many times?" he asked us.
"No," we all said at once.
"Well," said my father, "one day there was a boy who loved making up all kinds of stories just for fun. He told his father, who was a farmer, that a wolf was attacking his precious sheep, and the alarmed farmer, who loved his sheep, quickly ran to the pasture to see that the sheep were happily grazing away. And the kid just laughed. "I was only joking," he said. Over and over again he told his father that the wolf was attacking the sheep, and again the farmer would check on the sheep to find that they were absolutely fine. The boy would laugh and say, "I was only joking." One day it rarely happened, and the child said, "Dad, I'm not joking. This time there is a wolf attacking the sheep." But the father did absolutely nothing, because he believed his kid was making it all up, as every time he checked on the sheep, it had always been a joke. Why should it be any different this time, he thought to himself. So he ignored his son. The next day, to his absolute horror, he found 12 of his sheep all dead. They had been savagely killed by the wolf that the boy had seen, who might have been spared if only the farmer had believed his son's story.
"But, Daddy, we weren't lying. There really were 2 dead bodies here. I promise you," I insisted.
"If you say so, son," said my father, looking at me with a very sceptical, dubious look on his face, which said it all. He didn't believe me. One day my sisters and I were in the woods together when we heard men's voices, and immediately we went to hide behind a large redwood tree, as we were afraid. We knew our wood green could be accessed close to the open dirt road on one side of the valley, so it wasn't unheard of for people to venture in on our property, although of course it was rare, as it was private land. Imagine our immense shock when 2 men, their heads covered in black material bags, were thrown and pushed to their knees onto the earthen ground by this very aggressive, cold-blooded man who looked as savage as a pit bull terrier, along with his 2 unsavoury accomplices, all whom were rough, thuggish Philistines. They wore their sleek black hair gelled up in a rather punk rock style, and each of them had an expensive thick gold chain around their necks, with white vests to show off their sizable biceps, for they were built very well. When they pulled the black bags off their victims' heads, whose arms and legs were shackled by thick rope, I could see that these poor hollow-cheeked men had also been very badly beaten up. The eyes were almost closed up by the swelling and extensive bruising that they had incurred. Sadly, I noticed that both of these men were missing the digits from their hands, which I imagine was part of this inhumane punishment that they had obviously endured at the hands of these indecent, treacherous, uncultured yobs. The haggard, gaunt captives looked so dishevelled and weary, worn out and dog-tired from the uncouth persecution that they had endured, which I estimate must have been several days of horrendous sadistic torture. They seemed almost resigned to their plight, as if they'd sensed that there was no way of escape for them, and they were like lambs to the slaughter that put up
very little resistance. The pugnacious gang leader snarled like a fractious dog as both men whose eyes were fixed to the ground as they kneeled. He spat on the ground in disgust.
Did I not tell you? Anyone who betrays my trust is dead.
He began to kick the pasty-faced man with his heavy boots.
Sir, I can still get you the money, said the one peaky man, trembling in terror. Please give me a chance. I have children and a wife that need me. You should have thought about that before you messed around with the likes of me and failed to deliver on your promises. What use will I be to you dead, piped the man. If I'm alive, at the very least I can try and find Mr. Brenner for you, and then you'll get your money back. You're going to find Mr. Brenner, are you? Who absconded with 50 kilos of my finest cocaine? You're going to find him, are you? In your dreams, you'll never find him. Yes, I will. Just give me another chance. That's what you said 3 weeks ago. Over and over again you promised. But time's up, buddy. If you don't collect the payment, you pay with your life. You know the rules. There's no special treatment on my watch for anyone. What about you, Tim? What have you to say for yourself? Said the gangster, turning to the other man, who was as quiet as a church mouse. Go ahead and shoot me, sir, said the man. I can't take the savagery any more. You've literally sucked the life out of my soul. I've nothing to say. Get on with it. At that, the ruthless gangster then pulled his rifle out and shot the men at point-blank range, and they fell to the ground instantly, their lives extinguished in a single blow. It almost looked too easy. We watched in absolute horror as, along with his 2 boorish accomplices, the gangster retreated through the wood, and I could hear a car engine in the distance revving up as it drove off into the distance. My sisters and I were absolutely appalled by the callous atrocity of what we had just witnessed. This was the sort of brutish, oafish behaviour that happened in the movies, but not in 1970s America. Surely not. We remained hidden, because we suddenly sensed something or someone was coming, and we falsely perceived that maybe the horrible villainous thugs were coming back. Keep still, I warned my sisters. Someone's coming. All of a sudden we saw a dark, shadowy silhouette moving through the curtain of shrubbery, and I seriously thought I was hallucinating or even seeing things, for never in my entire life have I beheld such a peculiar, anomalous critter. It could have been described as human, but that would have been not altogether correct, for although human, the critter possessed very striking ape-like characteristics. What is that? Whispered my sister, looking at me in horror. It's so big! It's so scary looking. Without doubt, the critter was Herculean in size, towering at about 8 foot tall, 700 pounds, and 3 foot wide across the shoulders, with very long arms that tapered beyond the knees, with pronounced distinguished biceps and shoulders, and, of course, powerful, strong, tree-trunk-sized legs. The creature was covered in thick tufts of dark brown hair that seemed less dense over the torso area and under the armpits and knees. It possessed a pyramid-shaped head that sat on its shoulders rather like a boiled egg on a cup, without any evidence of a neck, for if there was one, it was concealed by an abundance of hair. The critter possessed a very distinguished human face, a furrowed, sloping forehead, a rather flat, widened nose, and deep-set, dark eyes. The critter moved over towards the dead corpses, and appeared to be astonished and confounded by what he'd discovered. We watched the solicitous creature using its large human-like feet to poke the bodies, as if looking for any signs of life, but of course there were none, for the bodies remained completely lifeless. The critter stood up, proud, erect and tall, rather reminding me of a tree trunk. He scratched his head in deep contemplation, making a strange chattering sound under his breath.
I could sense he was deeply troubled and rather dismayed to see 2 dead bodies. We watched him drag the corpses by their legs towards a large tree trunk, and he proceeded to dig up the ground, that appeared surprisingly soft already, which was an antithesis to the rest of the wood green, where the ground was solid and unyielding. "I think he's digging a grave," I said to my sisters. "Why would he do that?" my sister asked me. "I think he may feel sorry for the men," I suggested. "Perhaps he thinks they deserve a burial. Otherwise, left in the open, they'll be eaten by the coyotes, mountain lions, or bobcats. Maybe he's doing for them what he would do for his own kind." "Why should he care?" said my sister. "Perhaps because he's more human and compassionate than the thug who murdered these men in cold blood." We watched in amazement as the critter dug, with the assistance of a stone, a very sizable large hole in the ground, and then he rolled both bodies into the ground, covering them both with soil. He stood there for a while, surveying the scene, and once again scratching his head very thoughtfully, as though he was lost deep in thought, for he appeared intelligent and discerning. I couldn't help wondering if he'd also buried the 2 bodies that we had discovered before. Was it possible that they had been buried in exactly the same spot in the ground? For the soil, as I told you, was soft and yielding, unlike the rest of the wood green. Why was this odorous gangster, whoever on earth he was, using our wood grove as a dumping ground for all his victims? It defied rational explanation. Why did he not even bother to hide the evidence of his iniquitous crime, I wondered. Of course, when we told our parents what had happened in the wood green, it didn't go down very well at all, as you can imagine, and they didn't even pretend to believe me. We were having dinner, and I piped, "Guess what, Mum? We saw 2 men being shot dead in the woods today, and a great big hairy ape buried their bodies." My mother rolled her eyes at the back of her head and looked at my father for support. "Son," my father said, "what did I tell you about crying wolf? Haven't you learnt a lesson from my story?" "But it's true," I protested. "Why won't you believe me?" "Eat your dinner, James," my mother snapped, "and only open your mouth when you have something civilized and rational to say, something realistic and real, not in your head. I don't think any of those mystery books of yours you're reading are doing you any good whatsoever. They appear to be wreaking havoc on your imagination. I don't appreciate you making up such horrific, frightful tales. Personally, I'd like to get a good night's sleep, and I don't need my head filled up with all these twisted nightmare scenarios you're making up." "Tell them," I said to my sister, "tell them what we saw in the woods." My sisters remained quiet and very uncooperative, failing to come to my defence, which absolutely infuriated me. It was clear they did not want our parents to tarnish their characters by accusing them of being crazy, like obviously I was, and so they very wisely said nothing. "See," said my mother, "if there was any truth to your spurious allegations, don't you think your sisters would come to your defence? And I see that they haven't. They're afraid to say anything, Mum, because you never believe a word any of us say," I piped. "Off to bed with you now, James," snapped my mother. "I've had quite enough." While we enjoyed spending so much time in the wood green, after the horrifying incident that we had witnessed, we always had one wary eye open in the back of our heads, as we were rather afraid that the nauseating villain would come back. But luckily we never saw him again. And if he did come back to drop off some lifeless, unwanted cargo, we were very fortunate not to be around at the time. One day the sheriff pulled up at our drive, and I could see him in deep conversation with both of my parents, and the expressions on their faces looked deadly serious and very aggrieved. I could only imagine what they were talking about. I was to learn that he had informed my parents that the police were going to be searching the wood green on our land for any sign of dead bodies, as a police informer had told them that some bodies were likely to be found on our premises. "Are you sure, Sheriff?" asked my father. "Are you saying they're dead corpses on my land?" "I'm afraid so," said the sheriff.
For some reason, the corrupt drug lord that runs a sizable drug cartel dropped the bodies off of all his victims on your premises, adjacent to the dirt road, which gave him very easy access to the woods on your land. I think he felt very certain and secure that he wouldn't be seen, as it's exceedingly remote out here. I do gather his grandmother lives in this part of the world, so he knows it well. He loves visiting his grandmother while disposing of his unwanted cargo. He is crooked, contemptible, the type that needs to be placed behind bars, and the sooner the better as far as I'm concerned. We've had our eyes on his coming and goings of the cartel for over 5 long years now. Unfortunately, more and more evidence has come to light and is piling up against him. And we've had a few whistleblowers, but we need tangible evidence, so finding the bones of these victims is crucial to making a strong case against him in a court of law. Do you know that if anybody betrayed his trust or double-crossed him or was unable to collect his funds from the drugs, he would chop off their fingers and punch them brutally in the eyes and beat them with a leather thong until the flesh came apart, leaving them to suffer for many days until he chose to finally kill them. I gather he is big on the punishing lark and in making his victims suffer excruciating pain before he finally kills them, as an example and warning to the other members of his cartel, and a stark reminder of what will happen to them if they should betray his trust. Do you know he actually sends the fingers of his villains to other members of the cartel in the post, just to warn them that if they don't toe the line, this could be them next?
How awful, said my mother. He sounds like a real scumbag. Does this sort of barbaric stuff rarely go on in this day and age? Surely not.
I'm afraid so, ma'am, said the sheriff. There's a lot of evil under the sun, and just because you don't see it does not mean it's not going on. You should read Ecclesiasticals, ma'am. As for King Solomon wisely stipulated, there is nothing new under the sun. What has been before will be again.
Well, why would this drug lord bury the bodies on our land of all things? It seems nonsensical and outlandish, piped my father.
I told you, said the sheriff. He knows this area exceedingly well, thanks to his grandmother. The informer does not believe he buried the bodies. He thinks the bodies were killed on your land and then abandoned, or dead bodies were offloaded here for the wild animals to eliminate all the evidence. That's high risk, said my father. I'm surprised I haven't stumbled across any bones yet, or some clothes or shoes lying around.
That's because they're buried, I piped. I saw someone burying a couple of the dead men myself. Remember I told you, Mum, but you didn't believe me. My mother flushed with embarrassment. I'm sorry, Sheriff, she said, looking ever so awkward. James is rather inclined to be very imaginative. He's got a lovely imagination, so I didn't believe him. But he must have been telling the truth after all.
It's perfectly understandable, man, said the sheriff. Do you mind if I borrow James to show me where he saw the 2 bodies being buried, so that we can get the crime team to dig it all up?
My father looked ashen. He was not taking all this very well.
Sheriff, he asked, looking exceedingly unsettled and discomposed, how many dead corpses do you expect to find on my land?
We're not certain, said the sheriff, looking rather uncomfortable. Maybe a couple of dozen.
A couple of dozen? My father gasped. A couple of dozen dead bodies on my land? He said, looking very appalled. That's horrendous, Sheriff. This is an awful nightmare. Don't blame yourself for any of this, sir. I assure you, these things happen.
And so it was our wooded area was surrounded and teeming with tons of police vehicles, dozens of men, and crime scene tape everywhere. For 3 children, it was incredibly exciting. The men began to dig up the grave. and 24 bodies were recovered from the site. And although the deceased victims, according to the sheriff, were not men of good character, it wasn't really a surprise to any of us, as what kind of person would actually work for an evil drug lord? We could see the plastic-covered dead corpses being placed into the back of a coroner's van. Later that morning, the sheriff brought a young policeman to our door, who was shaking like a leaf and looked scared out of his skin.
"May I trouble you for some sweet tea, ma'am?" said the sheriff. "One of our men has rather had a dreadful shock. I think seeing all the deceased bodies has unsettled him greatly. He's new to the force, and the truth is, ma'am, one never gets over the atrocities one sees."
"Of course," said my mother, ushering the policeman into our kitchen and putting her hand against his forehead. "You are heating up quite badly," she said to him. "I think you have a soaring temperature." In my mother's younger days, she had been a nurse, so she knew exactly how to help the speechless man, whom appeared to be staring into space with a bemused, vacant, disorientated expression on his face. He clearly looked as if he'd had quite some shock. My mother made some sweet tea, in which she added a couple of shots of brandy, and handed it to the man, who began to wobble like a jelly. "I was a nurse for many long years," my mother assured him kindly. "I worked around dying people, and it wasn't easy. When I first started nursing, I could barely stomach seeing a dead person. But after a while it became an intrinsic part of my job. I gradually learnt to accept what was inevitable. You'll soon see in time you'll be able to learn to deal with the dead. It's not really that bad." The wilted man looked at my mother with eyes the size of saucers. "It's not the dead bodies I'm scared of, ma'am. It's the monster in your woods." I knew exactly what he was talking about. He had clearly seen the critter in the woods that we'd seen. His reaction to the beast was, in my opinion, way over the top. For although big and intimidating, it had not struck me as vindictive. For indeed the critter had shown compassion for all those dead bodies he'd buried. But appearances can be very deceptive at the very best of times. "Monster?" my mother asked the man. "Sorry, what are you talking about?" "Can I have some more brandy, ma'am?" said the man. "It helps me to think straight. It stabilises my nerves somehow." "Of course," said my mother, pouring him a couple more shots of brandy. "But don't overdo it," she teased. "The sheriff won't forgive me if you leave our premises in an intoxicated state." I watched the man calm down, as the brandy seemed to relax him and work wonders, because he began to talk. "Those dead bodies, ma'am, they weren't a pretty sight, I admit to that. But I do have a stomach of steel, and can handle most things, I assure you, even though I'm relatively new to the force. But dead bodies have never bothered me at all. I only had a scare when I decided to take a break from digging and went off to relieve myself behind a large redwood tree. All of a sudden I got this disturbing feeling that I wasn't alone, and that I was being watched and studied. I could feel chills going down my spine. I can't believe how frightened I felt. My heart began to race. Instinctively I sensed something was very off, and that was when I saw him. He was gargantuan. He was standing yards away from me, just staring at me. He didn't stop staring. I don't think I've ever felt so much fear in my life. I was terrified. I didn't even know how to react to this thing. Did I walk away, or did I run for my life? This critter possessed the presence of an apex predator, like a lion or a tiger or a bear, and I sensed danger in every fibre of my being. I can't tell you how colossal this thing was, because it was monstrously big. It looked like a man covered in hair, but a giant man, and it definitely wasn't totally human. It had those long arms of an ape, and the typical cone-shaped head you sometimes see in the ape species, but otherwise it was remarkably human. "What did you do?" asked my mother. "I just walked away. It didn't chase me or anything, and when I tried to tell everybody what I'd seen, the words didn't come out.
and everybody thought I was having a panic attack because of how gruesome the dead bodies appeared, with the fingers chopped off and so forth. I don't think the critter would hurt you, I told the man, interceding. I think he just looks scary. But he does have a good heart. He's intelligent. You've seen the monster? Asked my mother, looking more than a little startled. When, James? When did you see him? Why didn't you tell me about this? I did tell you. Remember, I told you about the ape man I saw in the woods. My mother once again looked very embarrassed. Sorry, dear. Your story sounded so far-fetched. It was impossible to believe. That's my problem, said the man. Who on earth is ever going to believe my story that I've shared with you? Mind you keep it to yourself, or I'll be the laughing stock of the force, and I'll lose my job and be relegated to the nut house, and I can't have that. So you better keep your mouth shut. I'm glad to inform you that the police successfully brought down that drug cartel, and they arrested the drug lord, and from what I gather he was sentenced to death, and I cannot say I lost any sleep over his fate, for he was a wicked, duplicitous man who deserved a harsh sentence. This all happened about 40 years ago, and I remember all this detail, graphically, as if it happened yesterday. I soon began to learn that the critter my sisters and I encountered was what we know as a Bigfoot. When I eventually inherited the farm from my father, I allowed my own children to have free rein on our property and play along in the wood green, much like I had done before them. Suffice to say, all three of my children encountered Bigfoot on several occasions, and the interactions were always benevolent. I hasten to say that instead of being remotely afraid, my children were very excited and enthralled by their curious encounter. They said the critter that they had seen was exceedingly kind. I asked my daughter why she thought the Bigfoot was kind, and this is what she said. Daddy, you can always tell when someone's nice. All you have to do is look at their eyes. The Bigfoot looked like he cared. He was friendly, and I think if we were in any kind of trouble, he would have helped us. At this, my other children fiercely agreed. Daddy, they said, we feel as if he's watching over us, as if he's protecting us in some way. The only horrifying event we had on our farm happened when my wife and I saw two men running in the wood green late at night. It terrified her to think that someone was loose on our property. She called me, and armed with my rifle, we followed the men into the woods. It was the weirdest experience of my entire life, as one minute they were there, and then they were gone. But my wife and I saw them very clearly, every single detail. I can't be sure if we saw two ghosts or not, but I have absolutely no explanation as to why these men vanished so suddenly before our very eyes. It has left me to conclude that maybe the spirits of the two men I saw shot on our land are loitering around the place. It's not impossible. I do know on occasions we have seen light orbs in our forest, which some believe are the souls of the departed, but I'm not courageous enough to go investigating, as I'm afraid of what I might actually see. So there you are. That's my story.
Well, hello there. I hope you enjoyed the Omnibus edition. We've got many more coming our way for you to listen to. Sending you love wherever you are in the world, in North America, Canada, Kenya, wherever you may be. I send you lots and lots of love. Thank you for listening to my Omnibus, and I really do hope you enjoyed it, because that's the whole idea about it, is to give you some interesting stories to listen to. So until next time, goodbye and good night.